She was a billionaire who could buy anything in the world, except the courage to say 3 words to the one man she actually needed. For 6 years, Dylan Cross showed up. To her family dinners, to her bad days, to every quiet Tuesday that didn't make the highlight reel of her life. And for 6 years, Charlotte Whitmore told herself it was just friendship. Then her mother opened her mouth at a graduation party and destroyed every lie they'd been hiding behind. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning Charlotte Whitmore turned 30, she stood barefoot on the cold marble floor of her kitchen and burned her toast. Not because she was distracted by anything dramatic. No urgent phone call, no crisis at the office, no existential revelation arriving on schedule with the sunrise. She burned it because she was standing there thinking about whether Dylan had remembered to pack Emma's allergy medication before the drive, and she forgot she was even making breakfast. That was the thing about Dylan Cross. He had this way of occupying space in her head without announcing himself. He didn't barge in. He just settled there, quietly, like furniture she'd stopped noticing until she stubbed her toe on it at 2 a.m. She scraped the charred edges over the sink, pressed the toast down anyway, and spread peanut butter over the damage like it never happened. His coffee is 2 sugars, splash of oat milk, no foam. The thought surfaced without invitation. Emma's EpiPen is in the front pocket of the blue backpack, not the red one. He always packs the wrong one first. Charlotte caught herself doing this sometimes, cataloging him. Not intentionally. It just happened the way breathing happened, below the level of conscious thought. She knew that Dylan slept on the left side of whatever bed he happened to be in, even in hotels. She knew he couldn't stand the sound of styrofoam. She knew he hummed old country songs when he was stressed. Not the words, just the melody, under his breath, like he thought no one could hear him. She knew all of this, and she had never once stopped to ask herself why. She didn't ask herself now, either. She ate the burned toast standing up, checked her phone, and went to get ready for her mother's party. The Whitmore estate sat on a little over 4 acres in the kind of neighborhood where the houses were old enough to have names. Charlotte's mother, Diane, had named it Fairhaven, sometime in the 1990s, after a village she'd visited in England and never gotten over. The name was carved into a low stone pillar at the entrance. Dylan had once asked, completely earnest, if it was named after the street, and Charlotte had laughed for about 4 minutes straight while he looked progressively more defensive. It's the house that has the name, not the street. Why would a house need a name? Why wouldn't it? Because it's a building, Charlotte. It doesn't have feelings. Fairhaven has feelings. I'm worried about you. She thought about that now, pulling through the gate in her slate gray SUV, the gravel doing its familiar complaint under the tires. Someone had already lined the front path with those little lanterns her mother loved. A rented tent had gone up at the side of the house, white fabric catching the late afternoon light. Her younger brother Marcus had graduated. MBA, top of his class, a whole future gleaming in front of him. Diane had started planning the party approximately 48 hours after receiving the news of his final grades and had spent the last 3 weeks in a state of organized panic that Charlotte had found deeply entertaining from a safe distance. She parked beside a catering van and sat in the car for a moment, just sitting. She wasn't nervous. That wasn't it. She just had this habit sometimes, before she walked into a room, of taking a second to make sure she was wearing the right face. Not in a dishonest way, more like an athlete doing a quick stretch before they stepped onto the field. You checked your posture. You settled your breathing. You decided how you were going to carry yourself. It had taken her years to realize this was something she did. It had taken Dylan approximately 45 minutes to notice it. You always pause before you walk into a party, he'd said once, watching her from the passenger seat. They'd been at her college roommate's wedding almost 4 years ago, and she'd had her hand on the car door handle for a beat too long. You do this thing where you go quiet, and then you it's like you put something on. Not fake, just armor. She'd told him she didn't know what he was talking about. He just looked at her with that particular expression of his, the patient, slightly tired one, and said, "Okay." She got out of the car. But yeah, the party wasn't scheduled to begin for another 2 hours. which meant the house was currently in the specific chaos that precedes hospitality. Diane Whitmore, standing in the middle of her kitchen, issuing calm, relentless instructions to a catering team that was very good at its job and did not need her instructions. Charlotte's Aunt Patricia, attempting to arrange flowers in a vase that was demonstrably the wrong shape for the flowers she had chosen. A cousin Charlotte, only vaguely recognized setting up a Bluetooth speaker on the patio and then getting into a quiet but clearly heated argument with someone on the phone about song selection. Charlotte navigated all of it, accepted a glass of water from a passing caterer, and went looking for her mother. She found Diane in the dining room, adjusting the position of chair covers with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb. "You're early," her mother said, without looking up. "You told me to come early." "I told you 3:30. Diane straightened up and looked at the clock on the wall. "It's 3:20. "I'm anticipating." Her mother turned and smiled at her, the warm, effortless smile that Charlotte had inherited the shape of but never quite the ease of. Diane Whitmore was 61 years old and moved through social situations the way water moved through a landscape, never forcing anything, always finding the path, always eventually getting where it needed to go. Charlotte envied her this. "You look nice," her mother said, and gave her arm a brief squeeze as she passed. "Is Dylan coming?" There it was. She'd been in the house for approximately 4 minutes. "He said he'd be here around 4, Charlotte said. "He's dropping Emma at her grandmother's first." Diane nodded in the way that meant she was filing the information and moving on. "Good. He can help Marcus with the drink table. Your brother has no spatial reasoning whatsoever. He got an MBA. From a business school, not a table-setting school." Diane was already walking back toward the kitchen. "Will Dylan eat the salmon? I can't remember." Charlotte paused, glass halfway to her mouth. "He doesn't love salmon. He'll eat it if there's nothing else, but he prefers the chicken." Her mother's voice floated back. "Good to know. I'll make sure the catering team sets aside a plate." Charlotte stood alone in the dining room for a moment, looking at the carefully positioned chairs, the pressed tablecloth, the faint dent in the carpet where the table had been nudged a foot to the left. Everything arranged just so, for a celebration that hadn't started yet, for a room full of people who weren't there yet. She drank her water and went to find something to do. Dylan Cross arrived at 3:58, which was very much on purpose. He had a rule about parties, specifically Charlotte's family's parties, which was that you didn't arrive exactly on time because that made you look like you'd been hovering outside waiting for the right moment. But you also didn't arrive late because Diane Whitmore noticed and would spend the next 20 minutes making conversation in a way that somehow made you feel the absence of your punctuality without ever directly mentioning it. 3:58 was safe, close enough to 4 that it registered as 4, early enough that he'd be genuinely useful before things got going. He changed twice before leaving his apartment, first into a dark button-down that he immediately decided made him look like he was trying too hard, and then into a plain gray Henley over dark jeans that he decided looked fine. He looked fine. It was a family party. That was an appropriate amount of effort. He grabbed the bottle of wine he'd picked out 3 days ago, a Malbec that Marcus actually liked because he'd asked, which he'd told himself was just being a thoughtful guest, and drove to Fairhaven. The gravel did its thing under his tires. He sat in the car for a second, which he did not have a name for, and then got out. Charlotte was in the yard when he came around the side of the house, talking to a pair of caterers near the tent, pointing at something with that focused, slightly impatient energy she had when she was working through a problem. She was wearing a deep green dress that he clocked for exactly 1 second before he looked away, because that was the appropriate thing to do. She saw him, and something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not like relief exactly, more like the small relaxation a room does when you open a window. "You're on time," she said, like it was an accusation. "I'm 2 minutes early." "I know. I'm impressed." She said it dryly. "Come help me figure out where my mother wants the extra chairs. She keeps changing her mind." "Did you ask her?" "She tells me a different answer every time." He followed her through the tent, and for the next 40 minutes they did what they always did at these things. Existed in the low-level useful hum of helping without being asked, talking in that shorthand they'd developed over years of being in each other's orbit, The kind of conversation that was maybe 30% actual information and 70% something else. Tone, rhythm, the comfort of a familiar frequency. Where does this go? Against the back wall, not the side wall. There's no logical reason for that distinction. I know, just do it. Done. What's next? Talk to Marcus. He's been pacing for an hour. Where is he? She pointed without looking. He went. Marcus Whitmore, 27 years old, freshly minted MBA, was standing near the outdoor bar looking at his phone with the expression of someone waiting for very important news that refused to arrive. Hey, Dylan said, coming up beside him. Marcus looked up. Something about his face immediately became less tense, which Dylan noticed but didn't comment on. He'd known Marcus for almost as long as he'd known Charlotte. The kid had been 19 when they met. Not really a kid, but playing one with reasonable commitment. He'd grown into himself in the years since, but he still had this quality of seeming younger than he was in moments when he didn't know anyone was watching. Man, Marcus said and put his phone away. You're here. I'm here. My mom has asked me where 6 different people are going to sit, and every time I answer, she changes the table plan. She does that. I know she does that. I just didn't think she'd do it to me. It's my party. She's expressing love through logistics. Marcus considered this. That's the most Charlotte thing I've ever heard you say. Dylan looked over his shoulder toward where Charlotte was now in conversation with her aunt near the flower situation. She says it better. She says everything better. Marcus leaned against the bar. How's Emma? She's good. She made a card for you. It has a lot of glitter on it. Marcus laughed, and it was genuine. I love that kid. She knows it. Don't let it go to your head. They stood together for a moment in the comfortable way of people who didn't need to fill silence with conversation. Somewhere in the house, a speaker started playing something low and easy. The caterers moved with quiet efficiency around the tent. The lanterns along the path had come on early, catching the last of the day's light before they'd be needed for the dark. You doing okay? Marcus asked, in the specific tone that meant he wasn't asking about today. Dylan looked at him. Yeah, why? No reason? Marcus shrugged, but it wasn't entirely casual. You just... I don't know. Never mind. Say it. I'm not saying it. Marcus, I'm not getting into it. He pushed off the bar. Come on. Help me figure out which extension cord goes with which speaker, or my mom is going to find someone to blame, and I refuse to be that person. Dylan followed him, deciding not to push. He'd learned over the years that Marcus said what he wanted to say, when he wanted to say it, and not a moment sooner. He filed it away and kept moving. By 6 o'clock, the party had arrived. Not all at once, parties never did. It assembled itself in pieces the way any crowd does. First the early arrivals who were actually on time, then the cousins who came in a loose cluster, then the older relatives who needed to find seats before the standing started, then the friends of Marcus's from school who arrived in a pack with the energy of people who'd been pre-gaming in the car and were trying not to show it. Charlotte moved through all of it with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating her mother's social world. She knew which aunts wanted to be asked about their garden. She knew which of Marcus's friends needed to be pointed toward the bar before they turned anxious. She knew that the catering staff needed a confirmation about timing around 6:15, and that if she didn't check in with them, nobody would. She did all of this, and in the background of all of it, she knew where Dylan was. This was not new. She'd always had a low-level awareness of his location in a room, the way you're aware of a sound you can't quite identify. Not consciously, just present. Tonight he was talking to her Uncle Gerald on the far side of the tent, which Charlotte knew because Uncle Gerald talked to anyone who stood still for more than 30 seconds, and Dylan was too polite to extract himself without a plan. She watched him find the exit, a comment toward Marcus, a gesture at the drink table, a clean escape that Gerald didn't even feel, and felt something warm and slightly exasperated move through her. He was so good at people. He always had been. There was nothing flashy about it. He didn't work the room the way some people did, didn't perform extroversion like a skill. He just had this quality of making whoever he was talking to feel like they were the only person in the space. She'd watched him do it 100 times. With her family. With strangers at parties. With Emma, which was different. With Emma, it wasn't a social skill at all. It was something else entirely, something that didn't have a clean name. She realized she was watching him walk back across the yard and looked away. Sylvia Chen, her closest friend from her 20s, and the woman she credited with keeping her sane through 3 business crises and one genuinely terrible haircut, appeared at her elbow. "You were doing it again," Sylvia said pleasantly. "I was not doing anything. You were tracking him like a satellite. I was looking across the yard, in his specific direction." "Sylvia, I'm not saying anything." Sylvia sipped her champagne. "I'm just a woman standing here making an observation. You're a woman standing here who needs to find someone else to observe." "There are many interesting people at this party," Sylvia agreed, and then didn't move. "Your mom is watching you, by the way." Charlotte did not look at her mother. "My mother watches everyone. It's her hobby." Sylvia looked thoughtfully at the bottom of her glass. "When are you going to tell him?" "Tell who what?" "Charlotte." "I genuinely don't know what you're talking about." Sylvia gave her the look that meant "I love you," and I see through every single word coming out of your mouth. "Okay," she said, with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Okay, that's fine. We don't have to talk about it." "Good." "Totally fine." "Great." Sylvia watched a cousin cross the yard. "Does he know you keep his old coffee order at your office? Like, do you think he's ever going to figure out that the cup that shows up on your desk every Tuesday is not for you?" Silence. "I like having options," Charlotte said. "You don't even drink oat milk." Charlotte straightened the strap of her dress. "I'm going to go check on the catering schedule." "Absolutely," Sylvia said. "Run." "I'm walking at a perfectly normal pace." She walked at a perfectly normal pace across the yard. Around 7, when the food had been out for an hour, and the crowd had reached that peak party energy where everyone felt comfortable and slightly warm and the conversation had gotten louder and more honest, Diane Whitmore called for everyone's attention. She stood near the head of the main table, champagne glass raised, entirely at ease with being looked at by 40-odd people. Charlotte, standing near the back of the gathering, watched her mother and felt the specific pride of someone who has spent years studying the person in front of them. "I am not going to make a long speech," her mother said, which was not entirely true, because Diane Whitmore had a very particular relationship with the word long. "I just want to say that watching your children become themselves is the most remarkable thing that happens to a parent. Marcus, you have always known what you wanted, and I have spent 27 years watching you go get it." Marcus, standing beside his mother, had the expression of a man trying very hard to look casual and not quite pulling it off. "You are the most determined person I have ever raised," Diane continued, and there was laughter in that because it was clearly meant with warmth. "And this degree is just the latest evidence that when you decide something matters to you, you do not stop." She paused, the way someone pauses when they've been speaking long enough to feel it. "We are so proud of you, every single one of us." To Marcus. "To Marcus," the crowd returned, and glasses went up. Charlotte raised hers. Across the gathering, Dylan caught her eye. He didn't say anything. He just lifted his glass and gave her that small, quiet smile, the one that lived mostly at the corners of his mouth and never quite reached the performance level of a real smile, but was somehow more sincere than most smiles she'd ever seen. She smiled back. And then, because Diane Whitmore was not done, and because families have a genius for creating the exact situation you are least prepared for, the moment shifted. It started simply. Marcus's friend from school, a tall, easy-mannered guy named Jordan, who Charlotte had met twice and remembered as relentlessly likable, asked the question in a lax, conversational way, the kind that doesn't feel loaded until it is. "So Charlotte, Marcus talks about you all the time, but I feel like I don't actually know much about you. What are you like when you're not running a company?" It was a normal question, the kind people asked at parties. Before Charlotte could answer, her Aunt Patricia, who had been holding a glass of Pinot Grigio for 3 hours, and therefore had reached the phase of the evening where she felt wonderfully unburdened, laughed warmly and said, "Oh, you should ask Dylan that. He could write the encyclopedia." Laughter, easy and unknowing. Charlotte felt the back of her neck do something. "He really could," Patricia continued, leaning toward Jordan with the enthusiasm of someone sharing delightful gossip that wasn't gossip because it was all very innocent. Charlotte talks about him constantly, the things she notices. She gestured with her glass. She always knows exactly how he takes his coffee. That old jacket he won't throw away, she mentioned it to me twice. That he hums to himself when he drives. That his daughter always... Patricia, Diane said, not sharply, but with a particular quality of not now that a mother deploys when she sees where something is going approximately 1 second before it arrives. But Patricia was warm and happy and did not hear the signal. It's sweet. I'm just saying she knows every little thing. It's obvious she... Patricia. This time it landed. Patricia stopped, blinked, looked around at the small cluster of faces near her. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. In a room, 3 seconds is nothing. In that specific silence, it was enormous. Charlotte had not moved. She was standing exactly where she'd been standing, glass in hand, with an expression that she could feel was carefully blank, even as the rest of her was not blank at all. Someone nearby made a smoothing comment. The conversation broke apart and reassembled into something safer. Marcus said something to Jordan that redirected the whole current of the interaction. But for just a moment before everyone started talking again, Charlotte looked across the gathering. Dylan was looking at her, not with surprise, not with the specific expression of someone who had just heard something they didn't know, with something quieter than that, something that looked like a question he'd been holding for a long time and had just heard, for the first time, the outline of an answer. Charlotte set her glass down on the nearest surface. She said, "Excuse me," to no one in particular, and she left. She didn't run. She was very clear about that later. Not that she said it to anyone out loud, but internally, in the court of her own self-assessment, she had not run. She had walked. Normally. Through the back of the tent and across the small side yard and in through the house's rear entrance. She had opened the door and closed it behind her with complete control of her hands. She went to the laundry room. This was not a decision, exactly. The laundry room was simply where she ended up, the way water ends up in low places. Not choosing, just going where there's room. It was small and functional and smelled like fabric softener, and it was not the party. She stood between the washer and a folding table her mother had owned for 20 years and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Every little thing. Patricia's voice, unbothered and cheerful. It's obvious. Charlotte pressed her palms harder against the folding table. The cool surface was useful, concrete, real. This was the thing about keeping a feeling somewhere it doesn't have to be named. You get very comfortable with the arrangement. You forget after a while that it is an arrangement. It starts to feel like just the way things are. The coffee order that shows up on your desk on Tuesdays. The reflex check on his location in any room. The way his name comes out of your mouth more often than you'd ever mapped. You forget that other people can see the map. Your aunt can see the map. Charlotte stared at the wall. The washer behind her ticked in the way appliances do after they've been run, cooling down and contracting. Somewhere further in the house, she could hear the muffled soundscape of the party. Conversation, laughter, someone's heels on the kitchen tile. She should go back. She was going to go back in approximately 2 minutes. She just needed 2 minutes first. The door opened. She didn't turn around because she already knew. The footsteps were wrong for her mother. Too heavy, too even. Wrong for Marcus. Wrong for everyone else. "Hey," Dylan said. "I'm fine," Charlotte said. "Okay," he said. He came in and let the door close behind him, and then he didn't say anything else for a moment. She heard him settle against the wall on the other side of the room. Not coming close, not putting his hand on her shoulder, just being in the same space. The way he did. The way he'd always done. "You don't have to check on me," she said. "I know." "I'm coming back in a minute." "I know." She turned around. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her with that patient, slightly tired expression. His gray Henley. His dark jeans. The old watch he'd been wearing since she'd known him. The band replaced twice over, but the watch the same, because his father had given it to him. And some things you don't trade out just because they're worn. She knew that about him, too. She knew so many things about him. "Your aunt had good intentions," Dylan said. "I know." She wasn't trying to... "I know, Dylan." Charlotte leaned back against the folding table. "I know what she was trying to do. She was being nice. She thinks it's charming. It probably is charming. She looked at the ceiling briefly. It's just... She stopped. What? He said. She looked at him. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her from across the party, with the question in it. It's embarrassing, she said finally. Standing there while someone reads out your tell. He was quiet for a second. What's the tell? She didn't answer that. I know his coffee order, she said instead to the middle distance, mimicking her aunt's voice without meaning to. That old jacket, what he hums in the car. What do I hum? Dylan asked. She looked at him. Old country songs. You don't do the words, just the melody. You do it when you're stressed. His arms uncrossed and then recrossed. I didn't know anyone noticed that. I noticed it. More silence. The washer ticked. The party went on somewhere else. Charlotte, he said, and his voice was different, lower, less careful, the specific tone that meant he was about to say something that didn't have a safety net. Don't, she said. I haven't said anything yet. I can tell you're about to. How? She met his eyes. Because I know you. He pushed off the wall. Not dramatically. He just stopped leaning against it, stood up straight, and crossed the 6 feet of laundry room between them in that steady, deliberate way he moved when he'd made up his mind. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could see the faint line of tension along his jaw, the thing he did with his hands when he was trying to hold something still inside himself. I've been trying to talk myself out of something for a long time, he said. Quiet. Not soft. Quiet is different from soft. Quiet was Dylan choosing every word, and I'm pretty good at it. I've had a lot of practice. Dylan, just let me... He stopped, took a breath. I told myself it was better not to. That what we have is... I kept saying we had something good, something real, and I didn't want to be the person who messed that up by asking for something you weren't offering. She was very still. But I've been thinking about what your aunt said. He looked at her steadily. Not the part that embarrassed you, the part before that, every little thing, because... He exhaled. Because I do that too. I know you take your coffee black on work days and with milk on weekends. I know you go quiet before parties. I know you call your mom on Thursdays. I know you have a tell when you're actually upset versus when you're annoyed, and they look nothing alike even though you think they do. A pause. I know your tell, Charlotte. She couldn't quite breathe normally. So I'm standing here trying to figure out, Dylan said, what exactly we've been doing for 6 years. Because I have a word for knowing someone the way I know you, and it's not the word I've been using. What word have you been using? She asked. Friend? The word landed in the room like something dropped. And you knew that wasn't the right word? She asked carefully. I knew it wasn't the complete word. He held her gaze. I was hoping if I used it long enough, it would become accurate. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The man who had shown up to every version of her life without being asked, who had eaten burned casserole at her table after a catastrophically bad quarter, who'd fallen asleep on her couch so many times that her mother had once casually referred to it as his couch, who had come to find her in a laundry room when she needed 2 minutes to herself because he always knew, without having to be told, when those moments were happening. I've been in love with you, she said. She said it simply, without decoration, because she wasn't the kind of person who dressed things up when she'd already stood with them long enough. For a while, she added. Then, after a second, a long while. Dylan didn't move. And I didn't say anything, she continued, because I didn't want to be wrong. Because if I was wrong, I'd lose you. And losing you... She stopped, looked down at her hands, and then back up at him. Losing what we have was not something I was willing to risk. So I didn't say it. A short, humorless sound. And apparently I didn't hide it as well as I thought. He exhaled, slow, like he'd been holding something in his chest for a long time and had just now let it down. You weren't wrong, he said. She looked at him. You weren't wrong, he repeated, and for the first time the careful steadiness of his expression came apart. Just slightly, just at the edges, just enough to see what was underneath it. I've been terrified of the same thing. Every time I got close to saying it, He shook his head. Emma loves you. My family thinks you hung the moon. You're woven into. He gestured vaguely, meaning all of it, everything, the whole shape of my life. And I kept thinking, if I say it and it goes wrong, it doesn't just affect me. So I stayed quiet. He met her eyes. And I hate that I stayed quiet. Yeah, Charlotte said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Yeah, he echoed. The room settled. So, she said. So, he said. She pushed off the folding table and closed the remaining foot between them. Up close, he was solid and real and known. This face she'd catalogued without meaning to, this person who had been occupying space in her life with a quiet, relentless fidelity that she'd told herself over and over was just friendship. For 6 years, she said. Give or take, he said. That's a long time to be careful. It is. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his jaw. Just her hand, just resting there, like checking that he was actually present in this room with her and not something she had assembled out of 6 years of wishing. He turned his face very slightly into her hand. Just slightly. Just enough. Charlotte, he said. Yeah, she said. He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind of kiss that exists in movies, where the lighting arranges itself and the music swells and every surrounding detail goes soft. It was two people in a laundry room, cautious and careful and a little bit overwhelmed, finally closing a distance that should have been closed a long time ago. It was brief, it was gentle, it was everything. When they pulled back, she was looking at him and he was looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because some things don't need a word attached to them immediately. Some things are allowed to just be what they are for a second before language catches up. The party was still happening on the other side of the house. The washer ticked. A burst of laughter came through the wall, muffled and warm. Dylan exhaled, and it was the most unguarded sound she'd ever heard from him. 6 years, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something she didn't expect. He laughed. Not a big laugh, not the performed kind. Just a short, real, slightly disbelieving sound. The laugh of someone who has just realized how long they've been standing in their own way. She smiled, and it felt like the first completely honest smile she'd had all night. We should probably go back, he said. We should, she agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. Outside, the lanterns were lit now. The voices of her family rose and fell in that familiar, imperfect music. Her mother was probably wondering where she was. Her aunt had probably already been gently talked to about reading people's feelings aloud at dinner parties. In the laundry room, Dylan Cross and Charlotte Whitmore stood together in the aftermath of something that had been coming for 6 years. Not entirely sure what happened next, but for the first time in a long time. Not afraid of it either. He reached over and straightened the strap of her dress. Just a small, automatic gesture, the kind of thing you do for someone whose presence in your life is no longer something you're pretending is simple. She caught his hand when he was done, held it. He held back. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They went back to the party. They walked out of the laundry room holding hands. Neither of them had discussed this. It was not a decision that got made out loud. It just happened the way the kiss had happened, the way most things between them happened. Without announcement, without a plan, simply as the next true thing in a sequence that had been building long enough that it no longer required deliberation. Charlotte's hand was in Dylan's hand, and they walked down the short hallway toward the rear of the house. And for approximately 15 steps, the world was quiet and simple and entirely theirs. Then they came around the corner into the kitchen and ran directly into Marcus. He was standing at the kitchen island with a bottle of beer and his phone, and he looked up when they came in, and his eyes went to their hands, and he went absolutely, completely still for a moment, the way a person goes still when they are processing information that is simultaneously surprising and deeply unsurprising. Hey, Dylan said. Hey, Marcus said, and his voice was careful in the way of a man who was choosing between several possible reactions and had not yet settled on one. Charlotte felt Dylan's hand shift slightly in hers, not pulling away, just adjusting, the small, unconscious movement of someone who'd become aware of being observed. I was just coming to find a glass of water, Charlotte said. Sure, Marcus said, still looking at their hands. Dylan reached over with his free hand, picked up a glass from the counter, filled it at the tap, and handed it to Charlotte. The whole sequence took about 8 seconds. Marcus watched all of it. Okay, Marcus said finally, and he put his beer down and straightened up. He looked at Dylan. He looked at Charlotte. He pressed his mouth into a thin line that was clearly suppressing something. Charlotte couldn't tell if it was a comment or a laugh or something more complicated. Marcus, Charlotte said, I didn't say anything. You're thinking extremely loudly. I'm thinking at a completely normal volume. He picked his beer back up. I'm going to go check on the music situation. He moved toward the doorway and then stopped and without turning around said, For what it's worth, about time. And then he was gone. Dylan looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at the glass of water in her hand. About time, Dylan repeated quietly. Don't, she said. I'm not saying anything. You're thinking extremely loudly. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Come on, he said, and the hand in hers stayed where it was, and they went back to the party. The tent was at the peak of its evening noise, that particular register where a gathering reaches its own momentum, where people are fed and warm, and the drinks have been flowing long enough that the conversations have gotten more honest without yet getting unmanageable. Charlotte navigated it in a way she didn't entirely recognize, because usually she moved through her mother's parties with a kind of professional ease, the social autopilot she'd been running since she was 15, and Diane had started including her in adult gatherings. Tonight, the autopilot was off. She was aware of Dylan in a different way than she'd been aware of him 4 hours ago. Not more intense, exactly. If anything, the constant low-level frequency she'd been managing all evening had settled into something more even, less pressurized. But it was different. The way he was holding her hand was different. The way he shifted when someone approached them, his shoulder slightly closer to hers, was different. Everything was the same and completely rearranged. Sylvia found her in approximately 40 seconds. Something happened, Sylvia said, appearing at her left shoulder with the unerring precision of a woman who had known Charlotte for 11 years. Her eyes went down and came back up. You're holding hands. Sylvia. With Dylan. I'm aware. Charlotte. Sylvia's voice was so carefully controlled that it was its own kind of loud. Did something happen while you were hiding in the house for 20 minutes? I wasn't hiding. You disappeared into the interior of the house and did not come back for 20 minutes. I was getting water. You're holding hands with Dylan Cross. Yes. Sylvia stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to look at Dylan, who was standing 2 feet away having a conversation with Charlotte's cousin about something to do with the stock market, and who had apparently decided that the best approach to the current situation was to act like a completely normal person at a party. Sylvia looked back at Charlotte. I need the full story later, she said. There's not much story. Charlotte. There's a story, Charlotte conceded, later. Sylvia nodded once, with great restraint, and then removed herself to a safe distance where she could observe without interfering, which was almost worse than interfering. Diane Whitmore noticed at 7:43. Charlotte knew the exact moment because she was watching her mother from across the tent when it happened. Diane was in conversation with one of her oldest friends, Eleanor Marsh, and her gaze swept the party the way it always did. The unconscious survey of a host checking on her gathering, and it landed on Charlotte and Dylan, and it stopped. For about 2 seconds, Diane Whitmore did not move at all. Then she said something brief to Eleanor, who nodded, and Diane excused herself and walked, at a perfectly measured pace, toward the drinks table, which happened to be near where Charlotte and Dylan were standing. She arrived. She picked up a glass. She said to no one in particular, "The weather is supposed to hold through the weekend." "That's good," Dylan said. "You two came back from inside at the same time," Diane said, still looking at the glass in her hand. "We ran into each other in the kitchen," Charlotte said. Her mother set the glass down and looked at the two of them, a look that Charlotte had been on the receiving end of for 30 years, and which could not be described as anything other than completely, quietly knowing. "I'm glad you found the water glasses. They're on the second shelf now. I moved them last month." "I found them," Dylan said. "Good. Diane put her hand briefly on Dylan's arm. Not Charlotte's. Dylan's, which Charlotte noted. There's more salmon if you want it, and there's a chicken plate with your name on it, literally. I had the caterers label it. She smiled at him, the warm, particular smile that she did not give to everyone, and then she moved back into the party. Dylan watched her go. Did your mother just— Yes, Charlotte said. She labeled a plate. She's been doing that in her head for a while, Charlotte said. I think she just finally decided it was allowed to be real. Dylan was quiet for a second. How many people in your family knew? Charlotte thought about it honestly. Most of them, I think. He looked at her. I said I hid it, Charlotte said. I didn't say I hid it well. He laughed. A real one. Surprised out of him. She felt it move through his hand into hers. It said, By 9 o'clock, when the formal part of the evening had loosened into the comfortable sprawl of people who didn't want to leave yet, Charlotte had stopped thinking about what they looked like to other people. She wasn't sure when that happened. It was somewhere between the moment her mother labeled the chicken plate and the moment Marcus came back through the party and stopped near them long enough to say, absolutely deadpan. So I told my friend Jordan that you two finally figured your lives out. He said he called it within the first hour of meeting you. He wants credit. He met us for 20 minutes, Charlotte said. He said it was a very informative 20 minutes. Marcus took a long drink of his beer. I'm just the messenger. Dylan shook his head and said nothing, which was the correct response. They stayed until almost 11. This was not unusual. Dylan often stayed late at Whitmore family gatherings because he was good company and because leaving always involved a series of goodbyes that somehow extended themselves by 45 minutes regardless of everyone's best intentions. But tonight, the lateness had a different texture to it. It felt less like staying because it was comfortable and more like staying because neither of them was quite ready to break whatever this evening had become. At 10:50, Aunt Patricia found Charlotte near the dessert table. Patricia was the kind of woman who moved through the aftermath of her own social blunders with complete serenity, either because she didn't fully realize what she'd done or because she had decided not to mind it. Charlotte had never been able to determine which. Tonight, Patricia looked slightly flushed and entirely warm, and she pulled Charlotte into a brief, perfumed hug and said, You looked wonderful tonight, sweetheart, and that man of yours is just— She gestured expansively. He helped Gerald find his jacket for 20 minutes, and he didn't even look annoyed. That's character. Charlotte opened her mouth and closed it. He's not my— She started and then stopped because that particular sentence had been in her mouth for 6 years, and for the first time it felt factually incorrect. Patricia beamed at her and moved on. Charlotte stood at the dessert table and picked up a small pastry and ate it without tasting it, because some moments required something to do with your hands. Dylan appeared beside her. What was that? Patricia being Patricia. What did she say? Charlotte looked at him. She said you didn't look annoyed while helping Gerald find his jacket. She said it indicated character. He reached past her and picked up a pastry. I was a little annoyed. I know. He told me the entire history of that jacket while we were looking for it. It's a vintage hunting jacket. He's had it since 1987. He told me that. In full detail, I'm sure. There was a story about a fishing trip. There's always a story about the fishing trip. He bit into the pastry. She ate hers. They stood at the dessert table, not looking at each other, having an entirely ordinary conversation about a jacket, and somehow that was the moment that felt most real to her. Not the laundry room, not the first time they'd walked back in holding hands, but this. The pastries and the fishing trip story, and the two of them standing the way they always stood, close enough that their arms were almost touching, talking about nothing in the particular way that meant everything. Hey, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad Patricia can't keep a secret, he said. Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest. Something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. Yeah, she said. Me too. They were two of the last 4 people to leave. The 10 had come down to a skeleton crew of caterers doing the quiet, efficient work of putting a party to bed. Marcus had gone inside an hour ago with his school friends. Most of the relatives had filtered out in waves. Sylvia had hugged Charlotte with approximately 30% more force than usual and whispered full story, tomorrow morning, I mean it, directly into her ear before departing. Diane was doing a final walk of the yard the way she always did, checking that nothing had been left on the grass and that the lanterns were accounted for. Eleanor Marsh was keeping her company. The four of them moved in loose parallel, Diane and Eleanor tracing the perimeter of the yard, Charlotte and Dylan walking the same direction without having coordinated it. "You drove tonight," Dylan said. Not a question. "Yes." "I can get a ride back. You don't have to—" "I'm not offering out of obligation," Charlotte said. He was quiet. "I'll drive you," she said. "Stop negotiating." "I wasn't negotiating. You were doing the thing where you give me an out so I don't feel obligated to do something I actually want to do." He looked at her sideways. "That's a specific thing. You do it a lot." He didn't argue that because he knew she was right. It was one of the things about him that she had filed away without labeling. This habit he had of offering exits, of making sure there was always a door she could leave through if she wanted to. She'd thought for a long time that it was just his way, that it was politeness or some form of consideration. Standing here, knowing what she knew now, she thought it might have been something else. A man trying very hard not to ask for too much from someone whose absence he couldn't afford. She understood that. She had done the same thing. They had both been so careful for so long about not asking for too much. They said goodbye to Diane, who kissed Charlotte on the cheek, and then, in a departure from her usual protocol, did the same to Dylan. A brief, genuine gesture that made him look slightly startled and then not startled at all, because this was Diane, and she always meant what she did. "Drive carefully," her mother said. "Always," Charlotte said. Diane looked at both of them with that quiet, encompassing look, and then she went back to her walk, and Charlotte and Dylan went to the car. The drive was about 30 minutes. They'd done this drive 100 times in various configurations. Charlotte driving, Dylan driving, one of them half asleep, one of them talking. The particular late-night car energy where the darkness outside the windows made everything feel more honest than it would in daylight. The road was familiar. The route was automatic. Charlotte drove and Dylan sat in the passenger seat, and for the first 10 minutes they didn't say much. And it wasn't awkward. It was the specific, comfortable silence that had been one of the things she valued most about him. The fact that he never needed to fill space just to prove he was present. He was present without performing it. But tonight the silence was different than usual too. Not uncomfortable, just aware of itself. "What are you thinking?" he asked, around the 15-minute mark. She considered the question honestly, which was something she didn't do with everyone. There were people in her life who asked what she was thinking as a social nicety, and she responded with the acceptable version of the answer. Dylan was not one of those people. "I'm thinking that I've driven this route so many times," she said, "and I've always known that the moment you get out of the car and go inside is the end of the evening. Like, that's the moment it's over. And I always—" She stopped. "What?" "I always watched you go in," she said, "through the front window. I always waited until your lights came on upstairs." The silence was different after that. "Every time?" he said. "Most times." She kept her eyes on the road. "I told myself it was just to make sure you got in okay. That it was a safety thing, being a responsible driver." "Charlotte, I know. You watched to make sure my lights came on. It sounds worse out loud." "It doesn't sound worse," he said. "It sounds—" He exhaled. "I used to hear your car pull away," he said slowly, "and I'd stand at the window for a second. After. Just standing there." She let that sit. "We're a couple of idiots," she said. He made a short sound. "Yeah. 6 years." "I know." "What was it?" she asked. "The first time you—" She gestured vaguely with one hand. "When did you know it wasn't just friendship?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Emma was sick, 2 years ago maybe? She had that stomach bug that went on for 4 days and I was running on about 90 minutes of sleep a night, and I had a work thing I couldn't push, and you showed up at 7 in the morning with soup that you had made, not bought. And you sat with her while I went to the meeting, and when I came back you were reading to her and she was asleep, and you were still sitting there." He paused. "I walked into that apartment, and you were sitting in Emma's room with a book in your lap, and she was sleeping, and you looked up at me, and you just said, 'She went down about 20 minutes ago. There's soup on the stove.' And I—" His voice changed register slightly, became more careful. I stood in the doorway and thought, I can't lose this. And then immediately after that, I thought, what exactly is this? And the answer that came back was not friendship. Charlotte drove. 2 years ago, she said, give or take. You didn't say anything? No? For 2 years. Charlotte? I know, she said. I know. I didn't either. She turned onto his street. The familiar block, the familiar buildings, the light already on in his entryway because he had a timer on it. I just want to say clearly for the record that we are both incredibly stupid. Noted, he said. Agreed. On the record. She pulled up in front of his building and put the car in park and left the engine running because that was the habit. The same habit she'd had every time she'd dropped him off. Engine running, quick goodbye, drive away. She didn't drive away. He didn't get out. The engine ran. Emma's at her grandmother's tonight, he said. I know. I'm going to an empty apartment. I know. He turned in his seat to look at her. Do you want to come up? I'll make coffee. It's almost midnight. I know. You'll make decaf, she said. Obviously. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, not stalling, thinking. Not about whether she wanted to say yes, because she knew the answer to that. Thinking about the shape of what they were standing at the edge of, and how going upstairs for decaf at midnight was not just decaf at midnight, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. Okay, she said, and turned off the engine. The apartment was quiet and warm in the way of a place that's been empty for a few hours. That particular settled stillness that's different from a room that's never been used. There were shoes by the door, the particular small shoes of a 4-year-old alongside Dylan's worn work boots. A drawing that Emma had made, taped to the lower section of the refrigerator because that was the height she could reach. 3 library books on the coffee table, 2 of them clearly Emma's. One of them a thriller Dylan had probably started and not gotten back to in 3 weeks because that was how it went with him and books. Charlotte knew this apartment. She'd been in it so many times that she knew its sounds. The way the heat made a specific knock when it came on. The refrigerator's particular hum. The way the third stair on the way up creaked. She'd known them for years and had never once asked herself why she'd memorized them. She sat on the couch while Dylan put the decaf on. The light was low. The drawing on the refrigerator was a purple horse she could see from here. Emma had been in a horse phase for approximately 5 months and showed no signs of emerging. She's really into horses, Charlotte said. I know. Dylan came around the kitchen counter and sat on the other end of the couch. She wants riding lessons. You should do it. I know, I keep meaning to. He leaned his head back against the couch and looked at the ceiling. There's a place about 20 minutes from here. I looked it up. I just keep not calling. I'll remind you. He turned his head to look at her. You always say that. And I always remind you. You do, he said. You genuinely do. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just the slight softening of someone who had just thought of something they hadn't quite articulated before. You know what I realized tonight? What? That I've never once had to ask you for help, he said. You just... He made a gesture with his hand, searching for the right word. You've just always been there before I needed to ask. The soup. The reminders showing up. A pause. Emma's allergy medication. You knew which backpack. She didn't say anything. I knew what that was, he said quietly. Even when I was telling myself I didn't, I knew what it was. The coffee maker made its finished sound from the kitchen. Neither of them moved immediately. I'm scared, Charlotte said. He looked at her. Not of this, she said, clarifying quickly. Of getting it wrong. Of... She searched for the honest version. We've been very good at what we've been doing, and I know what we said tonight, and I know what I feel, and I'm not second-guessing any of it, but I'm also aware that what we have is real and complicated, and there are more people involved than just us. She paused. Emma? Yeah, he said. She knows me already. She trusts me already. If we... Charlotte pressed her lips together. If this doesn't work out... It's not going to not work out, Dylan said. You don't know that. Charlotte. He sat up slightly, and his voice had that quality again, the one she'd heard in the laundry room. Lower, less defended, the tone that meant he was saying the thing without the safety net. I have spent 6 years being your friend, and it has been the most consistent, real, necessary thing in my life outside of Emma. I didn't let myself want more than that because I was scared of exactly what you just said. Getting it wrong, losing it. But here's what I've figured out tonight. He held her gaze. I've been so careful about not risking what we have, and the whole time, without knowing it, we've been building something that's already more than what I was trying to protect. It's already there. It's been there. He exhaled. So the question isn't whether I'm scared of getting it wrong. I am. Obviously I am. The question is whether what's already real between us is worth trying for something more. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. Yes, he said back. She crossed the couch and sat beside him, close, their shoulders touching, the same way they'd sat on 100 other nights on this same couch, watching movies or talking through problems, or sitting in comfortable silence. Everything the same. Everything different. He put his arm around her, which he'd never done before, and she leaned into his side, which she'd never done before, and both of them held still for a second as though adjusting to the weight of a thing that was finally allowed to exist out loud. The coffee's ready, he said. I know. Neither of them got up. They sat there instead in the quiet apartment with the purple horse drawing and the creaking third stair and the heat making its particular knock in the pipes. And Charlotte thought about how this room was already familiar, already felt like somewhere she'd belonged for longer than tonight, and how strange and right it was that the distance between best friend and something more had turned out to be the length of one honest conversation in a very small room. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at midnight. Still moving, still going, indifferent to the small and enormous thing that had happened between two people who had taken 6 years to find the right words. Inside, it was warm and quiet and entirely enough. Dylan reached over without moving his arm from around her and poured the coffee into the mugs he'd left on the table, which he could barely reach and nearly spilled doing, and she took hers and held it with both hands, and the whole sequence was slightly clumsy and completely unglamorous, and she was aware, with a clarity that didn't usually arrive this cleanly, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was perfect, because it was real. Thank you, she said. For the terrible reach across the table? For the soup story, she said. For telling me. He was quiet for a second. Then he pressed his mouth to the top of her head. Not a dramatic gesture, not a movie gesture, just a simple and honest one, and said, I should have told you sooner. We both should have, she said. Yeah, he said, but we didn't, and here we are. Here we are. She held her coffee and leaned against the man she'd been in love with for a long time, in the apartment she'd been walking into for years, and the night settled around them like something finally done being patient. She left at 2 a.m. Not because anything went wrong, nothing went wrong. They drank the decaf, and then Dylan made a second pot, regular this time, because neither of them was actually tired, and both of them had silently agreed without saying so that the evening wasn't finished yet. They talked the way they always talked, which was to say without a fixed destination, moving between subjects the way a conversation does when both people are comfortable enough to let it wander. Emma's horse phase, a problem Charlotte had been working through at the office for 3 weeks. The book on Dylan's coffee table that he'd started in February, and still hadn't gotten past chapter 4. Whether the Whitmore family would process tonight's events through a group text or through individual phone calls. And the general consensus was phone calls because Diane Whitmore did not group text. At one point, Charlotte said, My mother is going to call me tomorrow morning at 8. Dylan said, Optimistic. I'd say 7:30. She'll give it until 8 out of courtesy. She labeled the chicken plate, Charlotte. She's been waiting for this. Charlotte considered that. 7:45, final answer. I'll take that. They made a bet that involved the loser buying coffee for an entire month, which was the kind of bet they'd been making for years over things that didn't matter, and which Charlotte had won at roughly 60% of the time, and which Dylan disputed at roughly 80% of the time, and the whole exchange was so ordinary and so deeply theirs that she felt it land somewhere below her sternum in a way she didn't have a word for. She left at 2 because it was 2 in the morning, and she had a 7 o'clock call on Monday, and she was a person who needed sleep even when she didn't feel like she needed sleep. And Dylan walked her to the door, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, in the particular way of people who have recently recalibrated and are still learning the geometry of what that means. He kissed her at the door. It was better than the first one, which had been tentative and significant in equal measure. This one was quieter, like something that already knew it belonged. She drove home with the windows down even though it was cool, because she needed the air, because her chest felt full of something she didn't want to compress. She didn't call Sylvia that night. She sat in her own kitchen, in her own apartment that she'd designed carefully, and lived in alone, and kept the way she liked things. And she drank a glass of water and looked at the city through the window, and thought about how strange it was that the world could look exactly the same and feel completely different. Her phone buzzed. "Dylan, lights are on. Get home okay?" She stared at the message for a second. He'd reversed it. All the years she'd been waiting for his lights to come on, and She typed back, "Already home. You can see my building from your street." Dylan, "I know." She set the phone down. She was smiling, which she hadn't noticed until just then. Diane called at 7:42. Charlotte was already up, already on her second coffee, standing at the kitchen window watching the early light do its thing across the buildings when the phone rang. She let it ring twice out of pure principle, and then picked up. "Good morning," Diane said. "Good morning." A beat. "You left early. It was almost 11. That's not early for you." Charlotte drank her coffee. Dylan had to get up for Emma. The particular sound her mother made when she had a lot to say and was choosing the order carefully. "It's a nice morning here. Clear." "Mom, I'm making conversation." "You're making conversation the way you make seating charts, with an agenda." Diane was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, a real one, warm and entirely without pretense, the laugh that Charlotte had grown up measuring all other laughter against. "You have always been very difficult to ease into things. I get it from you. Your father would disagree. Dad agreed with you about everything and you both know it." Charlotte set her mug down. "Ask me what you want to ask me." Another beat, shorter this time. "Are you happy?" Charlotte had expected something procedural. What happened? When did this start? What are you planning? The directness of the actual question caught her in an unguarded place. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." "You think so?" She searched for the accurate version. "It's very new, officially. The rest of it isn't new at all. I'm still figuring out what the new part feels like." "That's honest." "You asked for honest." "I did." A pause that had warmth in it. "He's a good man, Charlotte." "I know." "Emma is a wonderful little person." "I know that too." "I labeled the plate," Diane said, "because I've been watching that man show up for you for 6 years, and I wanted him to know that this family has seen it, even if neither of you had gotten around to seeing it yourselves." Charlotte was quiet for a second. "That's a lot of message to put on a chicken plate." "I communicate efficiently," Diane said. "Apparently." Charlotte picked her coffee back up. "I'll come by on Sunday. We can talk properly then. Bring Dylan. Mom. And Emma, if she's available." "She's 4. She's not available." "Children have schedules. Don't be dismissive." A smile in Diane's voice. "Sunday, lunch." "Sunday," Charlotte agreed. They said goodbye, and Charlotte stood at the window for another few minutes, watching the city, thinking about her mother's voice when she'd said, "He's a good man." The simplicity of it. The way Diane had never once in 6 years said anything like that about Dylan, had kept whatever she thought quietly to herself, and had apparently been sitting with it long enough that it came out that easily, that clearly, the moment there was finally room for it. 7:42, Charlotte thought. She owed Dylan a month of coffee. She texted him, 7:42, "Start thinking about which coffee shop you want me to buy you for a month." His response came 12 minutes later, which meant he'd been up but not at the phone, which was typical. "I never doubted you. I'm still going to enjoy this." Then, a minute after, "Emma wants to know if you're coming over today." Charlotte looked at the message. She doesn't know what happened, she typed back. Dylan. She just asked. She asks about you a lot. Charlotte sat with that for a second. Emma asking about her was not new. Emma had been asking about her for as long as Emma had been old enough to ask about things, which was to say since she was approximately 2.5 and had decided that Charlotte was a fixed and reliable feature of her world in the uncomplicated way that small children decide things. But it felt different now. Not heavier exactly. More real. More something. Not today, she typed. I have calls this afternoon, but tell her I said hi and I want a full report on the horse situation. Dylan. She'll tell you herself. She's going to call you later. She's 4. She can't call people. Dylan. You'd be surprised. Charlotte smiled and put the phone down and went to get ready for her day. The week moved the way weeks move when something has changed and the world hasn't caught up yet, with a kind of low-level surreal quality, like the first days after you've moved to a new apartment and your body still reaches for light switches that aren't there. Charlotte went to work. She ran 3 meetings and restructured a contract that had been poorly drafted and pushed back on a projection that her CFO had been too optimistic about, and she did all of it with the same focused attention she brought to everything, because the company didn't reorganize itself around the fact that she'd had a significant personal development on Saturday night. She was not someone who let the personal leak into the professional, or at least she was very good at appearing not to. But in the gaps, the elevator, the 8 minutes between one meeting ending and the next beginning, the drive home on Tuesday night, she caught herself in the low-level awareness she'd always had about Dylan, except now it was reconfigured. Before, it had been a frequency she monitored without naming. Now it was something she allowed herself to simply notice. The text that came through around noon with a picture of something Emma had made at her grandmother's house. The brief call on Wednesday evening that started because she had a question about a mutual friend's birthday and turned into 45 minutes of conversation that meandered so far from its starting point, she couldn't have traced the route back if she'd tried. She didn't tell anyone at work. This was a considered decision, not a reflexive one. Charlotte was not in the habit of sharing personal information in professional settings, not because she was ashamed of anything, but because she valued the line between the two, and she had approximately 0 interest in becoming the subject of office conversation. Sylvia knew. Marcus knew. Her mother knew. Dylan's sister would know soon if she didn't already. That was enough for now. Sylvia got her full story on Sunday morning over coffee, in the particular mode Sylvia had that was somewhere between a debrief and a therapy session. The laundry room, Sylvia said. The laundry room, Charlotte confirmed. Of all the... Sylvia pressed her lips together. 6 years of whatever that was, and it happened in a laundry room. Is there a better option? I don't know, a rooftop, a meaningful location, something you could tell as a romantic story? I think it's a good story. It's a real story, Sylvia said, in a tone that meant she agreed but wasn't going to say so directly. She wrapped both hands around her mug. How are you actually doing? Good, genuinely. Are you scared? Charlotte looked at her. I said that to him too, Saturday night. What did he say? That he was scared too, that he thought what we already had was worth trying for something more. Sylvia was quiet for a moment, then, he's right. I know. I've watched you two for 3 years, Sylvia said, since I've known you both, and I want to say for the record that I have never once seen you with Dylan the way you are with other people you care about. How am I with him? Sylvia thought about it. Like you're not trying, she said finally. You try with everyone else. Not hard, not in an effortful way. You're good at people. But there's always a version of yourself you're managing. With him, you just... She shrugged. You're just in it. Whoever you actually are that day. Charlotte absorbed that. That's the terrifying part, she said. I know. Sylvia drank her coffee. It's also the best part. She saw Dylan on Wednesday evening at his apartment, which was not unusual. She'd been at his apartment on Wednesday evenings with some regularity for years. It had started when Emma was very small and Dylan had needed someone to be there while he made calls after her bedtime. And it had evolved the way all their habits evolved, which was to say, it had stopped having an original reason and simply become a thing they did. But on Wednesday, Emma was home. This was the part Charlotte had been thinking about since Saturday night. Not with anxiety exactly, but with the particular carefulness she brought to things that mattered. Emma was 4 years old and completely certain of her place in the world, which was the quality Charlotte admired most in her, and which also meant that any change to the structures Emma relied on would be felt and registered and responded to with the 4-year-old equivalent of a board meeting. Charlotte knocked on the door at 6:30. She heard the footsteps immediately. Small, fast, the particular percussion of a child who runs everywhere. And then the door opened, and it was Emma. Emma Rosalind Cross was 4 years and 3 months old, with her father's dark eyes and a quality of absolute self-possession that was entirely her own. She was wearing pajama pants covered in small horses, an extremely on-brand choice, and a purple sweatshirt that was at least a size too big, and had clearly been grabbed for comfort rather than coordination. "Charlotte," she said, with the gravity of a person making an important announcement. "Hi, Em." Emma turned and walked back into the apartment. "We're having pasta," she said, over her shoulder as an invitation. Charlotte came in. The apartment smelled like garlic and something with a slight chance of burning. Dylan was in the kitchen with the specific, focused expression of a man who is managing multiple things on the stove and didn't entirely trust himself. "Hi," he said. "Hi." She set her bag down. "Is something burning?" "No." A pause. "Possibly the edges." "Which pan?" "The small one." She went around the counter and moved the small pan off the burner, which had indeed started to catch on one side, and Dylan looked at it and said, "I had another 30 seconds. "You had about 10. "That's a matter of opinion. It's a matter of the pan." He looked at the pan. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." Emma had climbed back onto the couch and was arranging a series of small plastic horses on the cushion beside her with the purposeful concentration of someone conducting serious work. Charlotte went and sat on the other end of the couch and watched. "Who's that one?" Charlotte asked, pointing to a gray horse at the end of the line. Emma picked it up and held it out. "That's Smoke." "Why Smoke?" "Because she's gray, and Smoke is gray." Emma said it with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious. "This one is Butterscotch, a yellow horse, and this one is Captain." "Why Captain?" "Because he's the boss." "Okay." Charlotte looked at the lineup. "What are they doing?" Emma considered the question with genuine seriousness. "They're waiting." "For what?" "For something good to happen." Charlotte looked at the small horses arranged in a careful line on the couch cushion. "That sounds right," she said. Dinner was loud in this way that meals with a 4-year-old are loud. Not in volume exactly, but in density. Emma had approximately 17 things to report about her week, delivered in a non-linear order that required the listener to assemble the narrative themselves. There was something involving a dog she'd seen at the park. Something about a girl named Sophie at daycare who had said something Emma didn't agree with and the details of which were relayed with a specificity that suggested the event had been replayed in Emma's mind several times. There was a longer report about a book her grandmother had read to her, which Emma felt had not ended correctly and wanted to propose alternative endings to, out loud, at some length. Charlotte listened to all of it. She asked the follow-up questions. She took Sophie's side in the disagreement at daycare on the specific merits of the argument as presented, and then switched sides when Emma provided additional context, which Emma accepted with satisfaction. Dylan watched this across the table with a particular expression on his face that Charlotte only caught because she happened to glance at him at the right moment, something open and unguarded in it, something she'd seen before at the edges of moments like this, but which now she had a name for. She looked away before he could catch her looking. After dinner, Emma needed a bath, and then a book, and then a glass of water, and then confirmation that all her horses were on the shelf, and not one of them had been left on the couch because she'd had a dream once where one fell, and she hadn't quite gotten over it. Dylan handled all of this with the patient, slightly tired competence of someone who had been doing it long enough that it had become a physical language. The specific way he lifted Emma, the angle of the book when he read to her so she could see the pictures, The particular cadence he used for the last page of a story that Emma had learned to recognize as the signal that sleep was arriving, whether she wanted it to or not. Charlotte sat in the living room and listened to the muffled sound of it through the wall. She wasn't sure when she'd started feeling at home in this apartment. Not tonight. Not last week. A long time ago, probably. Long enough that she didn't remember the adjustment period, if there had been one. Dylan came out at 8:45, and the apartment had the quality it always got when Emma finally went to sleep. A settling, like a held breath released. "She's out," he said. "I heard." He dropped onto the couch next to her. Close, the way he'd sat on Saturday night. The way she was already adjusting to. "She told me about the horses," Charlotte said. "Captain is the boss, I'm aware. Smoke is the atmospheric one." "She named half of those horses in approximately 1 week," Dylan said. "A month ago, they were all just horses. Now they all have jobs and personalities, and I'm expected to know them." "You do know them." "I know Butterscotch and Captain. I have to pretend on the others." "She hasn't noticed?" "She's 4. She accepts a lot on faith." He leaned his head back. "She asked me if you were coming to her writing lessons." Charlotte looked at him. "She doesn't have writing lessons yet." "I know. She's planning ahead." He turned his head to look at her. "I signed her up. For the place 20 minutes from here. She starts in 3 weeks." "You called. You said you'd remind me." "You called before I reminded you." He held her gaze. "I didn't need the reminder." She sat with that for a second. "She asked if I was coming." "She did?" "What did you say?" "I said I'd ask you." Charlotte looked at the shelf of horses across the room, lined up with the precision of a person who cared very much about their arrangement. Smoke and Butterscotch and Captain and the others whose names she'd been given tonight and which she was already retaining. "I'll be there," she said. Dylan nodded once and didn't make anything out of it, which was the right response, and she appreciated him for it. They sat in that comfortable quiet for a while, the kind that doesn't require anything from either person, and Charlotte thought about Saturday night, the laundry room, the drive, the decaf that became regular coffee, the text that said lights are on. She thought about the week in between, the recalibration of something that had always been present but was now allowed to exist with its real name. She thought about Emma asking if she'd come to writing lessons before the lessons even existed. "I want to do this right," Charlotte said. Dylan looked at her. "I mean," she searched for what she actually meant. "I don't want us to be careless with her, with what she understands is happening." "Neither do I." "She knows me as your friend. Whatever we are now, she can't feel like the ground shifted without warning." "I know." "I'm not saying slow down," Charlotte said quickly. You're saying be careful," Dylan said, "that we don't let whatever this is between us happen so fast that she's trying to keep up." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. She could see it, the particular stillness that meant he was actually taking time with something rather than answering reflexively. It was one of the things she'd always liked about him. He didn't perform considerateness. He just was. "She already loves you," he said finally. "That's not new, and it's not conditional on what we call ourselves. But you're right that we should be thoughtful about it." He looked at the horse shelf. "She doesn't need a formal announcement. She needs to see that the way we are together is... that it makes sense. That it fits." "Does it?" Charlotte asked. He looked at her. "You sat on that couch for 45 minutes while she told you about Sophie from daycare and the dog and the book that ended wrong, and you engaged with every single part of it." "I was interested." "I know you were. That's my point." He turned slightly toward her on the couch. "Emma doesn't test people the way some kids do. She just watches. And she decides pretty fast whether someone is real with her or performing. She decided about you a long time ago." Charlotte thought about Emma holding out the gray horse. That's Smoke, because she's gray and Smoke is gray. The simple certainty of it, handing over a piece of her world without hesitation. "She's a remarkable kid," Charlotte said. "She is," Dylan agreed, and the way he said it, plain and full and without any decoration, was maybe the thing she loved most about him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her the same way he had on Saturday night, and this time it settled faster, like something that had already learned where it went. 3 weeks? She said. What? Emma's first lesson, 3 weeks. Right. I'll need the exact time. I'll send it to you. And what barn? Clearview, off Route 9. I know where that is. She paused. I've driven past it. He was quiet for a second. How many times? A few. It's on my way to... She stopped. Okay, it's not exactly on my way anywhere. Dylan's chest moved in a short, quiet laugh. Charlotte. I looked it up when Emma first mentioned horses. 5 months ago. I was curious about the options. You researched equestrian facilities for my daughter 5 months before I got around to calling one. I was curious. You were... He stopped laughing but kept the warmth of it. You've been in this longer than you think, he said quietly. She didn't argue that. Outside, the city moved through its nighttime frequencies. Sirens at a distance, the particular hum of a building with people in it, a door somewhere on the floor closing with the soft finality of a day ending. Charlotte closed her eyes and let the familiar sounds settle around her. She thought about the word Sylvia had used. Like, you're not trying. She'd never heard herself described that way and hadn't been sure in the moment if it was accurate. Sitting here now, she thought it might be. There was no version of herself she was managing. There was no face she'd put on before walking in. She'd just walked in, helped with the pan, sat with the horses, listened to Sophie from daycare, stayed for dinner. She'd just been there. I should go, she said at 9:30, and didn't move for another 10 minutes. Dylan didn't push her toward the door. He also didn't ask her to stay, because he understood, the way he usually understood her, that the particular shape of the evening didn't call for either of those things. It called for this, the slow unwinding of it, the gradual acknowledgement that the night was finishing, the absence of pressure in either direction. When she finally stood up, he walked her to the door. Sunday, she said. Sunday. My mother wants you there. And Emma, she asked specifically. I know, she texted me. Charlotte stopped. She texted you. Last night, very politely. Said lunch was at 1, and to please let her know if Emma had any dietary restrictions. Charlotte stared at him. My mother texted you about dietary restrictions. She also asked if Emma liked the color purple because she'd found a tablecloth she thought Emma might enjoy. She's going to be completely insufferable about this. She's excited, Dylan said. She's not being subtle. She has never been subtle about anything in her life. Charlotte picked up her bag. She labeled a chicken plate. She did. Within hours. To be fair, Dylan said, I think the plate had been labeled in her head for a while. Charlotte looked at him. A long while, he amended. She shook her head, and he opened the door, and she stepped out into the hallway, and before the door closed, she turned back and said, 2 sugars, oat milk, no foam. He looked at her. Your coffee, she said. For the record, I know it. He leaned against the door frame. Black on work days, milk on weekends, he said back. No sugar. You think sugar in coffee is a personality flaw. It is. You told me that 3 years ago. I stand by it. They looked at each other in the hallway outside his apartment, smiling like two people who had been keeping inventory of each other for years and had just finally admitted it out loud. Good night, Charlotte, he said. Good night, Dylan, she said. She walked down the hallway and she heard his door close, and she took the stairs down to the street, and the city met her at the door with its usual indifference to the particulars of individual evenings. She walked to her car and sat in it for a second before starting the engine. Not for any dramatic reason, just the same pause she always took, the moment of settling. Except this time it wasn't because she needed a minute before driving. It was because she was sitting in the quiet of her car outside the building where Dylan Cross and his daughter, with her shelf of named horses, lived. And she was thinking about Sunday, about lunch at her mother's table, about 3 weeks until a riding lesson at a barn she'd researched 5 months ago, out of a curiosity she hadn't been willing to name. She started the car. She knew where the light switch was now. She didn't have to reach for something that wasn't there. Sunday arrived with the particular quality of late autumn mornings that don't announce themselves. Gray at the edges, quiet, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more considered than it actually is. Charlotte was up at 6:30, which was earlier than she needed to be for a 1 o'clock lunch, but she'd slept poorly in the specific way of someone who isn't anxious about anything definable, but whose mind had decided to stay active anyway. She lay in bed for 20 minutes after waking, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, listening to the building settle, and then she got up because lying there wasn't doing anything useful. She made coffee. Real coffee. Not the decaf she'd been drinking at Dylan's apartment all week in deference to the hour. And she stood at her kitchen window with it and watched the city come online in its gradual Sunday way. There was a woman walking a dog on the street below. A large, unhurried dog that stopped every few feet to investigate something invisible, and the woman waited each time with the patience of someone who had made peace with the dog's schedule. Charlotte watched them until they rounded the corner and disappeared. She thought about what Dylan had said on Wednesday. "You've been in this longer than you think." She'd been turning that over since he said it. Not because she disagreed. She didn't disagree. She'd known the moment he said it that it was accurate. But because of what it meant about the years that preceded last Saturday. All the moments she'd been in, fully in, without the name for it. All the things she'd done that weren't friendship exactly, even if that was the word she'd been filing them under. She thought about the barn she'd looked up 5 months ago. She thought about the coffee order she'd had memorized for 3 years. She thought about every Thursday morning she'd called her mother and the phone call that preceded it, the one she never made but often almost made, the one that started, "I think I need to tell you something about Dylan," and then didn't happen because she could never figure out what the rest of the sentence was. She knew what the rest of the sentence was now. She finished her coffee and went to get ready. But Dylan texted at 9:47. "Emma wants to wear the purple dress. Is that okay for your mom's lunch?" Charlotte typed back. "My mom specifically got a purple tablecloth because of Emma. Wear the dress." A pause. Then, "She's going to think she planned this. She probably did plan this." Another pause. Then a picture came through. Emma in a purple dress, completely serious, holding Captain the horse with both hands and looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who had been asked to pose and was doing it on her own terms. Charlotte stared at the picture for longer than was strictly necessary. Then she saved it to her phone, which she did not examine too closely. "Tell her she looks excellent," she sent back. Dylan. "She says thank you, and also Captain is coming." "Obviously Captain is coming," Charlotte replied. "He's the boss." They arrived at Fairhaven at 12:55, which meant Dylan had done the math on the drive the same way Charlotte had. Not too early, not late, with the 10 minutes that served as a buffer for whatever Diane Whitmore had decided to reorganize in the final hour before guests arrived. Charlotte was already there, sitting on the front steps, when Dylan's car came down the drive. She'd gotten there at 12:40 because she'd left too early and driven around the block twice rather than arrive before noon. This was not information she planned to share. She stood up when Dylan parked. Emma was out of the car before Dylan had fully opened his door, moving with the fast, certain momentum of a child who had been promised something good was at the end of the drive. She was wearing the purple dress and sensible shoes and had Captain the horse tucked under one arm with the casual authority of someone who had simply decided this was how things were going to be. "Charlotte," Emma said, arriving at the steps. "Hi, Em. I brought Captain." She held him up briefly by way of explanation. "I heard. Good call." Emma considered the house with a measuring eye. "Is it big inside?" "Pretty big." "Does it have stairs?" "Yes." Emma filed this information away. "Okay," she said, and walked past Charlotte toward the front door with the purposefulness of a small person who had assessed the situation and decided it was manageable. Dylan came up the walk behind her, hands in his pockets, watching his daughter with the fond, slightly exhausted expression Charlotte had come to associate with the specific parenting experience of a child who had absolute certainty in every decision she made. "She's been asking about the stairs since we left," he said. "She asked about the stairs?" "She's been in a stair phase." "What does a stair phase involve?" "Counting them. Trying to go up 2 at a time. Evaluating the carpet." He looked at Charlotte. "Hi, by the way." "Hi," she said. He stopped on the step below her, which put them at approximately the same height, and looked at her for a second in the particular way he'd been looking at her all week. Not different from how he'd looked at her before exactly, just without the layer of careful management he'd always kept between what he felt and what he let himself show. "You look nice," he said. "You say that every time I wear this color." "Because you look nice in it every time." "It's olive green, Dylan. It's not a dramatic color. I'm aware of what color it is." She held his gaze for a moment. "Come on," she said, "before Emma tries to rate the carpet quality without us." He followed her in. Diane Whitmore opened the front door before they reached it, which was either coincidence or the result of someone watching from the front window, and the odds on the latter were significant. She looked at Emma first, because Emma was at the front, and her expression did something Charlotte recognized as the particular softening her mother reserved for things she found genuinely lovely. "You must be Emma," Diane said, crouching down to Emma's level with the ease that Charlotte had always admired in her mother. The complete lack of condescension in how she addressed children, the way she met them where they were rather than requiring them to come up. Emma looked at her with her frank, assessing eyes. "You're Charlotte's mom." "I am." Emma held up Captain. "This is Captain. He's the boss." "I can see that," Diane said seriously. "He has a very authoritative presence." Emma examined her face to check for sincerity and apparently found it. "Okay," she said, and walked into the house. Diane stood back up and looked at Dylan. Something passed between them that Charlotte caught and couldn't entirely decode, a look that had a lot of unsaid things in it, from her mother's side at least, and from Dylan's side a quality of quiet acknowledgement, like someone who understood they were being seen and had decided to let it happen. "Dylan," her mother said. "Diane." He held out a bottle of wine. "I remembered you prefer the Pinot." Diane took it with both hands. "You have always remembered that," she said. And then, in a tone that was entirely casual and entirely not, "Come in. It's cold." The lunch had 9 people at it. Diane, Marcus, Charlotte's Aunt Patricia, who had apparently been forgiven for the graduation party revelation with the ease of someone who genuinely hadn't understood there was anything to be forgiven for, Eleanor Marsh and her husband, a cousin named Will, who Charlotte liked better than most of her cousins, and the 4 of them. It was smaller than the graduation party by a factor of 5 and more intimate in the way that small gatherings always are, where there's nowhere to hide and conversation finds you regardless of where you sit. Dylan sat across from Charlotte, which was a detail she noticed because she'd expected to sit beside him, and instead found the seating arrangement, managed with complete innocence apparently by Diane, placed him directly in her line of sight for the entirety of lunch. This meant she could see his face clearly when Marcus said something that made him nearly choke on his water, and when Emma, seated to his left, gave him a running commentary on the table settings, in a voice low enough to be private but not quite low enough to actually be private, and when Diane asked him a question about his work, and he answered it with the direct, thoughtful quality he had in conversations where he was actually interested. She also noticed when he looked at her, which he did periodically, with that expression she now knew the name for. Eleanor Marsh, who was 72 and had known Diane since they were both in their 30s, and had therefore watched Charlotte grow up from a distance and had opinions about all of it, leaned toward Charlotte during a lull and said, very quietly, "He looks at you like you're the point of the room." Charlotte picked up her water glass. "Eleanor, I'm 72. I've earned the right to say what I see." "You've certainly decided that." "My husband looked at me like that for 40 years, Eleanor said, not quietly enough. "Don't waste time on being careful about it." Charlotte glanced at her mother, who was very deliberately engaged in a conversation with Will, and was not looking in Charlotte's direction at all, which meant she had almost certainly heard everything Eleanor just said. "I appreciate the advice," Charlotte said. "You're welcome, but..." Eleanor picked up her own water. "He's very handsome. I don't know if anyone's mentioned that." "Eleanor, I'm just noting it." Across the table, Dylan caught Charlotte's eye. He'd clearly gotten enough of the exchange to know something was happening even if he hadn't heard the specifics, and his expression was a carefully controlled version of a question. Charlotte shook her head, slightly, in the way that meant later. He nodded and went back to his conversation with Eleanor's husband, who was asking him something about cars, And Charlotte watched him redirect into that topic with the ease of someone genuinely interested and not just being polite. And she thought about Eleanor's 40 years, and she looked at her water glass, and she did not say anything that would encourage Eleanor to continue. Tipped. Emma, for her part, had the kind of lunch that Charlotte suspected she would remember for years if four-year-olds retained things in that way. Diane had indeed put out the purple tablecloth, which Emma noticed immediately and registered with a brief, full-body satisfaction that she then contained with dignity. She ate everything on her plate except the mushrooms, which she moved to the side with methodical thoroughness. She told Eleanor's husband about Captain's role in the horse organization, and he listened with the patient attention of a man who had been married for 40 years to a woman who said what she saw, and was therefore very good at giving people his full attention. After lunch, when the adults had moved into the comfortable post-meal state of people who weren't quite ready to leave the table but had finished eating, Emma climbed down from her chair and went to find the stairs. Charlotte tracked her out of the room and then looked at Dylan, who was watching the doorway Emma had disappeared through. "Go," Charlotte said. "She's fine." "Dylan?" "She's been waiting for those stairs for 2 hours. Let her have it." Charlotte considered this. "Your parenting philosophy is unusual." "She's going to count them," Dylan said, "and then come back and tell me how many there are. She doesn't need supervision for that. What if she miscounts? Then I'll recount with her." He looked at Charlotte across the table. "She's fine." He was right. 4 minutes later, Emma came back, climbed into her chair, and addressed Dylan directly. 14. "Yeah? And the carpet is blue. Good to know. Captain wants to see them later." "We'll arrange it," Dylan said. Diane watched this exchange with the expression of someone quietly adding something to a ledger that had been accumulating for a while. After lunch, when the meal had progressed to coffee and a cake Diane had made because she believed a meal without something sweet at the end was structurally incomplete, Marcus found Charlotte in the kitchen, where she'd gone to help with the coffee and also to give herself a moment away from the table. He came in and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, watching her figure out the unfamiliar coffee maker her mother had apparently acquired since Charlotte's last visit. "How are you doing?" Marcus asked. "I'm fine. I'm trying to figure out your mother's new coffee machine." "Our mother. She chose this one specifically to be confusing. This is a power move." "Charlotte." She looked at him. "I mean, actually," he said. "How are you doing?" She found the right button, pressed it, and leaned against the opposite counter while it started. "I'm good," she said. And then, because it was Marcus and he would see through a qualified version, "It's a lot. Not bad. Just a lot. Like standing in a room you've been in 100 times and realizing you've been looking at it with the lights at 60%, and now someone turned them all the way up." Marcus was quiet for a second. "That's a really good description. I've had a week to work on it. Are you scared? Why does everyone keep asking me that?" "Because you have a history of deciding things are fine when they're actually complicated. This is fine and complicated. Both are true." He nodded slowly. "He's different," Marcus said. "Dylan. This week. I've talked to him twice, and he searched for it. He's like someone who was carrying something heavy for a long time and finally put it down." Charlotte absorbed that. "He told me," Marcus continued, "that he'd been terrified of messing up what you had, that he'd convinced himself staying where he was the safer option." "He told you that?" "He told me that on Tuesday. We got coffee." Marcus shrugged. "He also told me he'd looked up equestrian programs for Emma 3 months ago and kept talking himself out of calling because he was busy. But honestly, I think he was waiting until he felt like things were stable enough to add something new." Charlotte looked at the coffee machine. "He looked them up 3 months ago. Clearview, off Route 9. Charlotte was silent for a moment. "What?" Marcus said. "Nothing." She pushed off the counter. "I looked it up 5 months ago." Marcus stared at her. "You don't. You both independently—" "Marcus. For the same kid. I am going to take this coffee back to the table without you if you finish that sentence." He pressed his lips together, but his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was trying not to laugh and losing. "I'm just saying," he said carefully, "that the two of you have been operating in parallel for years, and it's both incredibly sweet and also slightly maddening to witness from the outside." "I appreciate your perspective," Charlotte said, and picked up the coffee tray. 5 months, Marcus said to her back. She walked out of the kitchen. He followed, still trying not to laugh. No. The afternoon did what Sunday afternoons in the Whitmore house did, which was to settle into that long, unhurried quality that had characterized them for as long as Charlotte could remember. The particular kind of time that felt separate from the rest of the week, slower and warmer. Like the house itself had a different relationship with the hours. Emma eventually talked Diane into showing her the garden, and the two of them went out the back, Emma carrying Captain and Diane carrying a light cardigan she'd put over Emma's shoulders, with a practicality so unselfconscious it looked like habit, which meant Diane had already decided, in her quiet, irreversible way, that Emma was someone she was going to look after. Dylan watched them through the back window. Charlotte stood beside him. "Your mom," he said. "I know. She put a cardigan on her. She does that." He was quiet. "My mother's going to want to meet her," he said, which was the first time he'd said anything about his own family in this context, and Charlotte understood immediately that it was significant, not the information itself, but the fact of him saying it, the forward motion of it. "She's going to completely lose it, in the best way." "When are you going to tell her?" "I already did," Dylan said. Charlotte looked at him. "Wednesday night," he said, "after you left. I called her." He kept his eyes on the garden, where Emma was showing Diane something on the ground, a rock, probably, or an insect. Emma's interests were broad. She cried. She cried? "She's been waiting for me to... She kept telling me the last few years that I needed to let people in, that I was doing fine on my own, but fine wasn't enough." He exhaled. "She knew about you. I hadn't told her specifically, but she'd heard enough over the years that she'd put it together. She just waited." "Everyone waited," Charlotte said. "Apparently we were the last to know." "That's genuinely embarrassing." "Extremely." He turned from the window to look at her. "She wants to do dinner. My whole family. She said, and I'm quoting, 'Bring Charlotte, and the sooner the better because I've been patient long enough.'" Charlotte laughed. "How old is your mother?" 63. She has strong opinions and a very direct communication style. I like her already." "You've met her?" "Twice, briefly. I like her more now." He looked at her with that expression again, the open, unmanaged one. "She's going to love you," he said. "She already does, honestly. She just didn't have the right context for it yet." Charlotte looked back at the garden. Emma had sat down in the grass, purple dress and all, with the complete unselfconsciousness of a person who had not yet learned to worry about dirt. Diane sat in a garden chair nearby, watching her, and her face held something Charlotte hadn't seen on it in a while. A specific quality of ease, of satisfaction, the look of someone in exactly the right place at the right time. "She's going to have grass stains on that dress," Charlotte said. "I know. Are you going to do anything about it?" Dylan watched his daughter examine something in the grass with scholarly intensity. "No," he said. "She's fine." They left at 4:30, which involved the extended Whitmore goodbye sequence that Charlotte had grown up with and Dylan had been navigating for 6 years. The coats, the second round of hugs, the thing where someone always remembered one more thing to say just as you reached the door, and then the thing where you reached the door a second time and the same thing happened again. Emma said goodbye to Diane with a seriousness that suggested she understood the significance of the occasion. She shook Eleanor's husband's hand, which was something she'd apparently decided was appropriate, and which Eleanor's husband accepted with complete gravity. She told Marcus that his house was nice, and when Marcus pointed out that it was his mother's house, Emma considered this and said, "You live here too, probably," which was not entirely accurate, but which Marcus accepted. At the door, Diane held Emma's hand for a moment and said, "You're welcome here any time, sweetheart. Captain, too." Emma looked up at her. "Can I count the stairs again next time?" "Every time," Diane said. That settled it. Emma nodded once and went to find Dylan's hand, which she took with the comfortable certainty of a child who knows exactly where safe things are. Charlotte hung back for just a moment while Dylan walked Emma to the car. Her mother stood in the doorway. "Sunday lunch," Charlotte said. "Sunday lunch," her mother said back. It was both a recap of the afternoon and an offer, and they both understood it as both things simultaneously, which was the particular efficiency of people who had known each other for 30 years. "We'll come back," Charlotte said. Diane looked at her with those quiet, knowing eyes. "I know you will," she said. And then she squeezed Charlotte's hand once, briefly, and said, "Go. They're waiting." Charlotte went. The drive back to Dylan's apartment was different from the drive to Fairhaven. Fuller, in the way a drive is when there's more in the car than there was on the way out. Not just Emma in the back seat, narrating things she saw from the window with the commentary of someone who found the world perpetually interesting. Not just Dylan in the passenger seat, which had become the default arrangement without discussion since Charlotte had been driving and he'd gotten in and that was how it was. But the afternoon itself, somehow, still present in the car with them. Emma fell asleep 20 minutes from the apartment. It happened fast, the way it did with children. One moment she was pointing at a building and identifying its color, and then she was quiet. And then when Charlotte checked the mirror, she was entirely gone, Captain still tucked under her arm, the purple dress with its grass stain on the left knee. Charlotte glanced at Dylan. He'd seen it happen too. He turned forward and they drove in the particular quiet of a car with a sleeping child in it, which is its own kind of silence. Softer, more deliberate. "Your mom put a cardigan on her," Dylan said quietly, because the sleeping child protocol was in effect. "I know." "She's going to remember that," he said. Not meaning Emma, or maybe meaning Emma too, but primarily meaning himself. The way you file away the moments when someone treats your child like they matter. Charlotte kept her eyes on the road. "My mother keeps a box in her closet," she said. "It's been there my whole life. She puts things in it. Nothing valuable, just objects. A button that came off a coat she loved, a ticket stub, a napkin from a restaurant where something important happened." She paused. She'd never admit to sentimentality, but the box is there. Dylan looked at her. "I think she added something today," Charlotte said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your family's good," he said. "They're a lot." "They're good. Don't do that." She glanced at him briefly. "Do what?" "The thing where you qualify something that doesn't need qualifying." She didn't argue that. "They love you," she said instead. "I know." "Marcus thinks of you like—" "I know," he said again, and his voice had something in it that was not casual, even if it sounded like it was trying to be. "He's been—" "I know." She let it rest. They rode in quiet for a few minutes. Outside the windows, the city shifted from the residential width of the suburbs into the denser, more vertical landscape of the neighborhood where Dylan lived. The light was low now, that early evening gray that came before the streetlights, the color of the day winding down. "Can I ask you something?" Dylan said. "Yes." "When did you know it wasn't just friendship? For you?" He said it carefully, not urgently, the way he asked things he'd been sitting with for a while. "You said at the party that you'd fallen in love with me a long time ago. I told you mine. The night with Emma sick. I want to know yours." Charlotte thought about it the way she thought about things she was going to answer honestly. Fully, without the quick summary she'd give someone who asked a casual version of the same question. "There was a Thursday," she said, "about 3 years ago. I'd had a genuinely terrible week at work. One of those weeks where everything goes wrong and none of it is dramatic. It's just relentless. Small failures stacking up. And I called you. I called you before I called my mother, which I didn't notice until after. We talked for 2 hours. You didn't fix anything. You didn't try to. You just—" She changed lanes. "At the end of the call, you said, 'You're going to be fine. You're the most capable person I know. Go to sleep.' And you hung up." "I remember that call." "You do?" "Not perfectly, but I remember you were—" He thought about it. "Tired in a different way than usual, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing, so I mostly just listened." "That's what I mean," Charlotte said. "You mostly just listened. And at the end of 2 hours, you said exactly the right thing, which wasn't even a complicated thing. It was just the true thing. And I hung up and sat there and thought. She exhaled. I thought, I call him before my mother. I call him before anyone. And the reason isn't proximity or habit. She paused. That was the Thursday, I knew. Dylan looked at the road ahead of them. 3 years, he said. 3 years. You didn't say anything. You didn't say anything either. No, he said. I didn't. They drove. Emma slept. The city settled into its early evening rhythms outside the windows. We lost 3 years, Dylan said. Not with anger, with the plain acknowledgement of it, the specific weight of something that's true and can't be changed. We did, Charlotte said. I don't want to lose anything else. She glanced at him. He was looking at her, and there was nothing careful in his expression. None of the managed qualities she'd learned over years to read past. It was just the open, direct thing underneath. The thing that had always been there and which she could now look at without looking away. We won't, she said. He reached over and put his hand on hers on the center console. Not dramatically, not making a thing of it, just placed it there with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided that this was where it belonged and was done deliberating about it. She turned her hand over and held his. In the back seat, Emma slept through it all. Captain tucked under her arm, the purple dress with the grass-stained knee, completely unconscious of the 2 adults in the front seat holding hands on a Sunday evening, driving home from a lunch where a woman she'd just met had put a cardigan on her shoulders and told her she was welcome any time. She'd count the stairs again next time. She'd already decided. The car moved through the city, and the streetlights came on one by one as the evening properly arrived. And Charlotte drove with her hand in Dylan's and the sleeping child in the back seat and the afternoon behind them and everything else, all of it, still in front of them. Emma woke up when the car stopped. It happened the way it always did with her. Not gradually, not with the slow surfacing that adults do, but all at once, like a light switched on. One moment she was completely gone, and the next she was sitting up straight, eyes open, Captain still in her arm, looking around with the immediate alertness of someone taking inventory. We're home, Dylan said, from the back seat, where he'd moved when they'd arrived, and he hadn't wanted to wake her getting her out. Emma looked at the building, then at her father. Then at Charlotte, in the driver's seat, who had turned around to check on her. I fell asleep, Emma said, with the tone of someone reporting a fact they found mildly inconvenient. You did, Charlotte said. Emma considered this. Did I miss anything? The streetlights came on, Dylan said. Emma absorbed this. All of them? Most of them. She nodded, filed it, and held out her arms to be picked up. Dylan got her, and Charlotte got out of the car and locked it, and they went up to the apartment in the elevator because Emma was still in the soft, warm territory between sleep and full wakefulness, and the stairs were a different day activity. Inside, Dylan put Emma on the couch and went to the kitchen to get her the glass of water she always needed after sleeping in the car, and Charlotte sat beside Emma on the couch because Emma had leaned against her with the unceremonious confidence of someone who had decided this was an available option. Charlotte sat very still for a moment, aware of the small, warm weight of Emma against her side, the purple dress with the grass-stained knee, Captain held loosely in one hand. Charlotte, Emma said. Yeah? Your mom has a nice garden. She does. There was a bug. I saw you looking at something. It was a good bug, Emma said with the authority of someone who had assessed it. Not a bad bug. How do you tell the difference? Emma considered the question with genuine seriousness. Bad bugs are fast, she said finally. Good bugs don't run away. Charlotte thought about this. That's a pretty good system. I know, Emma said. Dylan came back with the water, and Emma drank half of it and then handed the glass back to him with the unthinking ease of someone who trusted completely that their needs would be received without comment. He took it, set it on the table, sat on Emma's other side. The 3 of them sat on the couch, which was not an unusual arrangement. They'd sat like this before, watching something on TV or just existing in the apartment on a slow afternoon, except that it was different now in the way everything was different now, which was to say not visibly different to anyone looking in through a window, but different in the knowledge of it, in the thing they'd named, in the absence of the careful management they'd both been running for years. Emma fell back asleep between them. It took about 4 minutes. Dylan looked at Charlotte over Emma's head. Charlotte looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. The first real test came 11 days later, and it arrived without warning the way real tests do, without the courtesy of announcing themselves as significant. It was a Tuesday. Charlotte was in the middle of a day that had been going sideways since 9 in the morning, a contract dispute that had escalated past where it should have been allowed to escalate, a board member who had sent an email at 7 a.m. with the energy of someone who had been composing it since the previous Thursday, and a presentation she'd been preparing for 2 weeks that her assistant had just informed her had been moved from Thursday to tomorrow. She was in her office at 6:30 in the evening, which was not unusual, rewriting the presentation's third section from scratch, because the data it had been built on was slightly wrong in a way that was small enough that most people wouldn't catch it, and large enough that Charlotte could not in good conscience stand in front of 20 people and present it. Her phone rang. Dylan. She picked up because she always picked up when it was Dylan. Hey, he said, and she could tell immediately, from the particular quality of his voice, that something was wrong. What happened? A short pause. Emma's sick. Charlotte was already standing up, which she hadn't made a conscious decision to do. What kind of sick? Fever. It came on fast. Her daycare called at 2 and I got her, but I had a thing at 4 I couldn't push, so my neighbor Gail watched her, and I just got home and she's... He stopped. She's at 103. Did you call the pediatrician? On hold, I just wanted to... He stopped again. I don't know why I called you first. Charlotte picked up her laptop with her free hand. I'm coming. You have the presentation. I have a laptop. I can work from your kitchen. She was already closing things on her desk, the one-handed efficiency of someone who had made the decision and was now just executing it. Have you given her anything for the fever? Children's Tylenol, 20 minutes ago. Okay. Did she eat today? Some crackers, not much. That's fine. Don't push it. Charlotte picked up her bag. I'll stop and get soup, not the canned kind. There's a place on Meridian that does a chicken broth. She might take that. Silence for a second. Then, Charlotte. What? Thank you, he said. And it was not the easy, reflexive thank you of everyday courtesy. It was something more compressed than that, something that had weight to it. I'll be there in 40 minutes, she said. She was there in 35, which required a series of parking decisions she would not defend under scrutiny, a container of chicken broth from the place on Meridian that she'd had to sweet-talk out of a closing kitchen, and the laptop bag she'd grabbed off her desk, still fully packed with the files she needed. Dylan opened the door before she knocked. He looked like someone who had been holding something together through effort rather than ease, the competent surface he always maintained, but thinner tonight. She could see the edges of the worry under it. She's in her room, he said. How's the fever? Down a little, maybe 101. Good, the Tylenol's working. Charlotte handed him the soup. Heat this up. Not too hot. She needs to be able to drink it. I'll go see her. She went down the hall to Emma's room. Emma was in bed with 2 horses lined up on the pillow beside her, Captain and Smoke, the 2 Charlotte could always identify. And her eyes were open but dull with the particular flat quality of a sick child, the absence of the usual bright alertness. Her face was flushed. Hi, Em, Charlotte said from the doorway. Emma looked at her. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just a small settling, the specific easing of a child who has been managing something hard and has just seen someone arrive who makes managing it slightly less necessary. I don't feel good, Emma said. Her voice was rougher than usual. I know. Charlotte came in and sat on the edge of the bed. She put the back of her hand against Emma's forehead, an instinct, not a medical assessment, and Emma leaned into it slightly. Your dad's heating up some soup for you. It's the good kind, not the kind from a can. Does it have noodles? It's a broth, but if you drink some of it, tomorrow we can do noodles. Emma considered this negotiation and found it acceptable. Okay, she said. Charlotte sat with her while Dylan heated the soup, and Emma told her in the slower, quieter version of her usual narration that she had not felt well since morning, but had not said so at daycare because she had been hoping it would go away. Charlotte did not tell her that she should have said something sooner because Emma already knew that and didn't need it said, and also because Charlotte herself had a history of doing exactly the same thing, hoping problems would resolve themselves if she just kept going and didn't look at them directly. "That doesn't always work," Charlotte said instead. Emma looked at her. "Did you try it?" "Many times." "Did it ever work?" Charlotte thought about 6 years of not saying something. "Not really," she said. "Not with the things that mattered." Emma absorbed this with the literal seriousness she brought to most information. "Okay," she said. Dylan brought the soup. Charlotte worked at the kitchen table until 11 o'clock that night. She rebuilt the third section of the presentation with the focus that came from necessity. Not the ideal condition for creative thinking, but sufficient for making something accurate, which was all she needed it to be. Dylan moved between the kitchen and Emma's room in the easy rotation of a parent managing a sick night, and Charlotte was aware of him at the edges of her concentration without losing the thread of what she was doing. At 9, he brought her coffee without being asked. At 9:45, he reported that Emma's fever was at 99.4, and she'd drunk most of the soup and gone back to sleep. At 10:30, he sat down across from her at the kitchen table with his own coffee and opened his laptop, because there was something he'd meant to get done tonight and hadn't, and they worked in parallel in the kitchen, two people getting things done at the same table, which was both completely ordinary and something Charlotte was aware of in a way she hadn't been aware of ordinary things before. Their particular value, the specific weight of them. "How's the presentation?" he asked at some point. "Fixed. Better, actually. The data issue forced me to rethink the framing. Problems occasionally do that. Don't be wise at 10:30 at night." "Sorry." She kept working. He kept working. The apartment held its nighttime quiet around them. At 11, she saved everything and closed the laptop. "Go home," Dylan said. "You have an early morning." "I know." "I've got her. She's over the worst of it." "I know." Charlotte put her laptop in her bag. "I know you've got her. You've always got her." She stood up. "That's not why I came." Dylan looked at her from across the table. "I came because you called," she said simply. "And I wanted to be here." He held her gaze for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She went and looked in on Emma before she left. Emma was asleep, both horses on the pillow, the fever flush faded from her face. She'd kicked the covers into a sideways arrangement that looked deeply uncomfortable, but which Charlotte had come to understand was apparently fine. Dylan straightened the blanket from the doorway, the practiced gesture of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. And they stood there together for a moment, in the doorway of Emma's room, looking at the small sleeping person who had rearranged so many things about both of their lives without ever trying to. "She told me good bugs don't run away," Charlotte said quietly. "She told me that last month," Dylan said. "She's been workshopping it." Charlotte smiled. "It holds up." She left, and he texted her when she got home, which she'd expected, and she texted him when Emma's fever was fully gone the next morning, which she knew about because Dylan had texted at 7:15 with an update he hadn't needed to send, but had anyway. She stood in her kitchen reading it and thought about the word first. He'd said it on the phone that night. "I don't know why I called you first." He hadn't needed to explain it. She hadn't needed him to. She understood the grammar of it, not that she was first in rank, not some hierarchy of people in his life, but first in the sense of instinct, first in the sense of automatic, first in the sense of the person your hands dial before your brain is finished deciding. She'd been that for him without either of them naming it. Now it had a name. She drank her coffee and got ready to go present a stronger version of her presentation to 20 people. And she did it well because she was Charlotte Whitmore, and she was very good at her job, and she got home that evening to a text from Emma, sent from Dylan's phone, dictated by Emma, and reading, "Hi, it's Emma. Emma. I feel better. Captain says thank you for the soup. Also, Smoke says thank you." And then, added apparently by Emma, without Dylan's involvement, "Also, Dad says thank you, but he's being quiet about it." So I said it for him. Charlotte read that last line 3 times. Then she typed back, "Tell Captain and Smoke they're welcome. And tell your dad I heard him anyway." The dinner at Dylan's mother's house happened on a Saturday 3 weeks after the graduation party, 4 weeks after the laundry room, which meant that by the time Charlotte pulled up in front of Ruth Cross's house, in the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and the houses were modest and well-kept, and had been lived in long enough to carry the accumulated character of real use, by the time she sat in her car for exactly as long as she allowed herself before getting out, the new thing between her and Dylan had stopped being new in the fragile sense and had started being new in the solid sense, the kind of new that has already proven it can hold weight. Ruth Cross was 63 years old and made no pretense of being casual about Charlotte's arrival. She opened the door before Charlotte had finished walking up the front path, which meant she had been watching from the window, and she didn't try to pretend otherwise. She was a shorter woman than Charlotte expected, with Dylan's dark eyes and an energy that was warm and direct in equal measure, the kind of person who had decided life was too short for circling around things. "Charlotte," she said, and took both of Charlotte's hands in hers before Charlotte had processed that a handshake or a hug was even happening. "I've been waiting to do this properly for a very long time." "Ruth," Charlotte said, "come in. Everyone's in the kitchen making too much noise." She kept one of Charlotte's hands and led her inside. "Dylan told me you take your coffee black on work days and with milk on weekends. It's Saturday, so I have both options ready because I didn't want to assume." Charlotte looked at Dylan, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had warned no one. "He mentioned the coffee," Charlotte said. "He mentions a lot of things," Ruth said warmly. "He just doesn't always know he's mentioning them." Dylan's sister, Naomi, was 28 and had her brother's build and none of his restraint. She hugged Charlotte within 45 seconds of introduction and said, "Okay, I have to tell you, I've been forming opinions about you for 4 years based on what Dylan doesn't say, and you're exactly what I expected, which is very satisfying." "What did Dylan not say?" Charlotte asked. Naomi glanced at Dylan. "A lot," she said pleasantly. Dylan picked up a dish towel and did something with it that had no practical purpose. Dylan's brother-in-law, Naomi's husband Pete, shook Charlotte's hand and said, "I've been told I'm not allowed to say anything embarrassing," and then immediately said, "He talked about you so much that Naomi started calling you the Charlotte situation, and we had a whole—" And then Naomi put her hand over his mouth. "The Charlotte situation," Charlotte repeated. Dylan put the dish towel down. "I'd like to note that I didn't name it that." "You didn't name it at all," Naomi said, removing her hand from Pete's mouth. "That was the whole situation." Emma, who had been in the living room with Ruth's ancient and extraordinarily patient tabby cat, and was now in the kitchen doorway because the noise had drawn her in, looked between the adults with the assessing expression of someone following a conversation they found interesting. "Charlotte," Emma said. "Yeah?" "They're talking about you." "I gathered." Is that okay?" Charlotte looked at Dylan's family, Ruth at the stove, Naomi at the counter, Pete leaning against the wall with the slightly chastened expression of someone who just had his mouth covered. She looked at Dylan, who was looking at her with the open, undefended expression she'd come to rely on as a signal that she was in the right place. "Yeah," she said, "it's okay." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to the cat. The dinner was loud and warm and ran 2 hours past, when anyone had planned to end it, which was the specific indicator of a meal that had gone well. Ruth made more food than was necessary, which Dylan had warned her about in the car on the way over. She cooks for the version of the gathering she imagines, not the actual number of people. And the excess was not a problem because everyone ate more than they'd planned to, which was also a Ruth Cross dinner tradition. Charlotte was asked approximately 40 questions, not in an interrogative way, but in the way of a family that was genuinely interested and had been waiting to be allowed to ask. She answered them all honestly, which was easier than she expected because there was no version of herself she was managing at this table. She'd noticed that earlier this week with Dylan and noticed it again now with his family. The absence of the things she always carried into rooms, the slight bracing, the pre-calibration. She was just sitting at a table, eating Ruth's pot roast, being asked about her work and her family and how long she'd known Dylan and what she actually thought of his apartment decor, which Ruth described as minimal to the point of a cry for help. "It's very clean," Charlotte said diplomatically. "It's empty," Ruth said. "He has the horse shelf now," Charlotte offered. Ruth looked at Dylan. "Is that because of Emma or Charlotte?" "Both," Dylan said. Ruth pointed at Charlotte. "See, this is what I mean. He needs someone who makes him add things." "Mom," Dylan said. "I'm not wrong." "You're not wrong," Dylan agreed. "Can we talk about something else?" "No," Naomi said cheerfully. They didn't talk about something else for another 20 minutes. And then the conversation drifted to Pete's job and then to Marcus's new role, which Naomi had heard about through Dylan and had thoughts on, and then to Emma's writing lessons, which were now 2 weeks away and which Emma had reminded everyone about twice during dinner already. "Clearview, sir," Ruth said, nodding, "and I know that place. It's good." "Charlotte found it," Dylan said. Ruth looked at Charlotte. "He looked it up too, well," Charlotte said immediately. 3 months ago," Dylan said. "She looked it up 5 months ago." "I was curious," Charlotte said. Ruth looked between them with the expression of someone who had just confirmed a long-held suspicion. "You too," she said, shaking her head, but she was smiling, and it was the wide, real smile of someone who was not unhappy about what she was seeing. Emma, who had been eating quietly, looked up. "I want a horse," she said. "We know," said Dylan, Naomi, and Ruth simultaneously. Emma looked at Charlotte. Charlotte put her fork down. "We'll see how the lessons go," she said. "If you're really good at it and you keep loving it." "Charlotte," Dylan said. "I'm not promising anything," Charlotte said quickly. "I'm saying there's a process." "What's a process?" Emma asked. "It means we take it one step at a time," Charlotte said. Emma considered this. "Okay," she said, "but I'm going to be really good at it." "I know you are," Charlotte said. Ruth watched this entire exchange from the head of the table with an expression Charlotte didn't catch until it was almost over, soft and still and full of something that had been waiting a long time to have a place to land. On the drive home, Emma asleep in the back seat again, Charlotte and Dylan in their habitual positions, the city moving past the windows in the particular way it did on Saturday nights when the week was over and the world had paused briefly between one thing and the next. Dylan said, "She loves you already." Charlotte kept her eyes on the road. "Emma?" "My mom." She was quiet for a second. "She's very easy to feel comfortable with." "She's been asking me about you for 2 years," he said. "Not pushing, just asking, the way she asks about things that matter to her." He looked out the passenger window. "She said to me last month, Sharb, before the graduation party, before everything, she said, 'Dylan, whatever Charlotte Whitmore is to you, don't let the definition get in the way of the truth.'" Charlotte let that sit for a moment. "She's smart," Charlotte said. "She's very smart. I come by it honestly." He turned from the window to look at her. She saw it because she knows what it looks like when I'm trying to manage something I feel. She's been watching me do it my whole life. "What does it look like?" He thought about it. "I get very practical," he said. "Very organized. I start focusing on logistics when I don't know what to do with the feeling. I call it problem solving. It's actually just," he shook his head slightly, "avoidance with better optics." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I get quiet," she said, "when I don't know what to do with something. I have very good posture about it. I look like I'm thinking clearly, which I'm not. I'm just waiting for the feeling to get small enough that I can deal with it without it being obvious." "How often does that work?" "Not as often as I thought it did." She glanced at him. "Apparently everyone can see the map." He made the short, real sound that she'd learned was his actual laugh, different from the social one. "Your aunt could see it." "My aunt could see it," Charlotte agreed. "I owe her an apology and also probably a thank you." "Definitely a thank you." "Don't push it." He put his hand over hers on the center console. She turned her hand over. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next." "What does come next?" "Not a plan," he said quickly. I know we said we weren't going to be careless. I'm not trying to rush anything." He paused. I've been thinking about what I actually want. And I've been honest with myself about it in a way I wasn't letting myself before. What do you want? He was quiet for long enough that she glanced at him. This, he said. Exactly this. You in the driver's seat, Emma in the back. Saturday nights that run long because nobody wants to leave. Your mother labeling plates. My mother making too much food. He looked at the road ahead of them. I want the ordinary version of it, not the idea of it, the actual thing with all its inconvenient parts. Charlotte drove. She thought about what she wanted, which was not something she'd had a lot of practice doing honestly, in the personal rather than professional sense. She was good at strategic wanting, at identifying what a company needed, what a room needed, what a moment needed. The personal kind was harder. It required a different kind of permission. I want Emma's writing lessons, she said. I want to be there. She paused. I want Sunday lunches at my mother's that run long. I want your sister's opinions and your mother's pot roast and Pete saying things he's not supposed to say. She looked at the road. I want to be the person you call first. I want to have already been that person, which I think I was. She exhaled. I want the ordinary version too, with all its inconvenient parts. She felt his hand tighten slightly over hers. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They drove the rest of the way home in the good silence of two people who had said the true thing and didn't need to add anything to it. The writing lesson happened on a Saturday morning in the third week of November, which arrived with the cold clarity of a day that had decided to be beautiful, despite the season. Clearview Equestrian was exactly what Charlotte had expected from the website she'd been looking at for 5 months. A working barn, not a manicured one, with the honest smell of horses and hay and cold air and the specific atmosphere of a place that existed for a purpose rather than for an impression. The instructor was a woman named Gwen, who was approximately no-nonsense, and who assessed Emma in about 4 seconds and spoke to her directly without talking down to her, which Emma registered and responded to by immediately paying complete attention. Dylan stood beside Charlotte at the fence, watching Emma sit on a small gray horse named after a river Charlotte couldn't remember, getting her first lesson in how to hold the reins from a woman who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. She's not scared, Dylan said. No, Charlotte agreed. Emma was, in fact, the opposite of scared. She was focused in the way she was focused when she'd decided something was serious, her small body careful and attentive, her eyes on Gwen, her hands on the reins with the deliberate grip of someone being told exactly how to do a new thing and doing it. She's going to be good at this, Charlotte said. Yeah, Dylan said. Not the reflexive parental agreement, but actual observation, the kind he made when he was seeing something clearly. Emma made it around the small ring once at a walk, Gwen at her side, and at the end of it she looked over at the fence with an expression of absolute satisfaction. Dad, she called. I see you, Dylan called back. Charlotte, Emma said. I see you, Em. Emma looked at the horse beneath her, then back at them. His name is River, she said. Good name, Charlotte called. I know, Emma said, and Gwen said something to her and she turned back, and the lesson continued. Dylan was quiet for a moment, then, she said both of our names. She usually does, Charlotte said. Not in that order, he said. Not like that. Charlotte looked at him. Like you're both the thing she looks for when something good happens, he said. He was watching his daughter, and his voice had the quality it had in the moments when he wasn't constructing anything, when the feeling was just present without architecture. Not just me, both of you. Charlotte didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have been as true as the silence. They stood at the fence and watched Emma Cross have her first riding lesson on a horse named River, and the cold November air was sharp and clean, and the barn held its particular smell of living things, and somewhere in the ring Gwen said something that made Emma laugh, a real laugh, the full body kind she had, and the sound of it carried across the space between them like something completely uncomplicated. This was the thing about ordinary mornings, Charlotte thought, about the Tuesday nights in a kitchen and the Sunday lunches that went long and the drives home in the dark with a child asleep in the back seat. They didn't announce themselves as the important moments. They didn't arrive with music or with the sense of occasion that you'd expect from something significant. They were just there, present. quietly building the structure of a life that two people were choosing, one small true thing at a time. She'd spent years managing the feeling at 60%, keeping it at a distance she could control, telling herself it was friendship, telling herself it was enough, telling herself that naming it would break something she couldn't afford to lose. What she hadn't understood, what neither of them had understood, was that the thing they were afraid of losing was never in danger from the truth. It was only ever in danger from the silence. The truth hadn't broken it. The truth had just shown them what it actually was. Not the fragile thing they'd been protecting, but something that had already proven, over 6 years of showing up and staying and knowing the small, true details of each other, that it could hold. You couldn't lose a thing that was already that real. You could only stop pretending it was something smaller than it was. Dylan reached over and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and Emma went around the ring a second time on River, and the cold morning held them all in its clean and different light. "Hey," Dylan said. "Yeah." "Thank you for the barn," he said. "You called. You found it." "5 months ago," she said. "5 months ago," he said. She felt him press a brief kiss to the top of her head, the same gesture he'd made in his apartment weeks ago, the same simple, unhurried thing. Not a performance, not a moment he was creating, just the natural expression of someone who was exactly where he wanted to be and was no longer pretending otherwise. Emma came around the ring again, and this time she wasn't looking at the fence. She was looking at River's ears, which Gwen had apparently told her something about, and her face held the focused, private concentration of someone learning a language they'd already decided they were going to speak. Charlotte watched her and thought about the horses on the shelf. Captain the Boss, Smoke the Atmospheric One. The careful lineup on the couch cushion on a Wednesday night. They're waiting for something good to happen. Something good had happened, not in the way of stories that resolve cleanly, where the hard parts were retroactively worth it, and everything lands in the right place at the right time. In the real way, where things were still complicated and nobody had solved everything, and Emma was going to keep losing the horses behind the couch cushions, and Charlotte still had a board member who sent 7 a.m. emails, and Dylan still talked himself out of phone calls he should have made, and all of it was still true and still present and still their actual lives. But something good had happened. The two people at the fence were not the same people they'd been a month ago, not because they'd changed, but because they'd stopped hiding from what they were. And Emma Cross, 4 years old, in a helmet slightly too big for her and a borrowed pair of riding gloves, went around the ring on a gray horse named River, and the November morning held its cold, clean light, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what had been growing between them all along, waiting patiently for the moment they were both ready to call it by its name.